a suspended detective, a disgraced ex-cop, a serial killer who stages his victims like domestic dolls, and a Florida county that would rather look away. Mr. Lonely. Chapter 1. The sun beat down on the curved aluminum roof of the Airstream like a physical hammer. John Bohannon knelt on a folded towel, sweating through a gray t-shirt, working a stiff putty knife into a gallon bucket of black marine sealant. The coastal humidity was 90%. The metal beneath his knees was hot enough to fry an egg, radiating the August heat right through the thick terry cloth. He scooped a heavy glob of the black tar and slapped it over a cracked rivet seam, scraping it flat. He hated roofing work. He hated the smell of the petroleum distillates burning his nose, and he hated the fact that water always found a way inside anyway. But a tropical storm had ripped through 2 weeks ago, and the ceiling above his kitchenette was weeping brown water onto the linoleum. The harsh scrape of a dying muffler broke the electric drone of the cicadas in the scrub oak. Bodert stopped scraping. He wiped the sweat out of his eyes with the back of a tar-stained wrist and looked toward the road. A faded silver Honda Civic turned off the cracked asphalt and onto his dirt track. The driver took the turn too fast. The Civic hit the first major rut, and the undercarriage screamed against the exposed limestone. The car didn't slow down. It fishtailed through the loose sand, kicking up a rooster tail of pale dust, and skidded to a stop right at the edge of his concrete slab. The Ford F-250 sat parked on the opposite side of the slab, a rusted giant compared to the battered import. The driver's door of the Civic popped open. A woman stepped out into the crushing heat. She was in her late 30s, with dark hair chopped into a severe utilitarian bob that barely reached her jawline. She wore faded denim jeans and a plain black t-shirt. She slammed the car door shut, ignoring the cloud of dust settling over her shoes. Bodert watched her from the roof. She stood with the rigid, hyper-aware posture of someone who spent 10 hours a day wearing Kevlar. Her eyes swept the concrete slab, cataloging the rusted Ford, the weeds pushing through the cracks, and finally the man kneeling on top of the trailer. She didn't wear a badge on her belt, but the hem of her black t-shirt caught the breeze, briefly exposing the hard, unmistakable geometry of a Kydex holster carrying a compact Glock inside her waistband. "You Bohannon?" she called up. "Usually." "Come down." Bodert set the putty knife on the lid of the sealant bucket. He stood up slowly, feeling the familiar, lingering stiffness in his right knee, and walked to the edge of the Airstream. He swung his legs over the side, found the top rung of the aluminum ladder with his boot, and climbed down to the concrete. He grabbed a rag smelling heavily of mineral spirits from a lawn chair and scrubbed the black tar off his hands. "You lost?" Bodert asked. "No." She closed the distance between them, stopping just outside of arm's reach. Up close, the exhaustion in her face was stark. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes, and her jaw was set so tight the muscles twitched. "My name is Elena Cruz. I need a private investigator. I don't do divorces. I don't follow cheating husbands. I don't have a husband." She crossed her arms. "I'm a detective with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. Homicide Division." Bodert tossed the rag back onto the lawn chair. He looked at the unbadged waistline, then at the beat-up Honda Civic. County detectives drove unmarked Crown Vics or Explorers. They didn't drive 15-year-old imports with heavily oxidized paint. "Where's your county ride, detective?" "Sitting in the motor pool," Cruz said, her voice completely flat. "Along with my shield." Internal Affairs took both of them on Tuesday. "What did you do?" "I put my service weapon inside a suspected fentanyl dealer's mouth because he wouldn't give me a name," she said. She didn't blink. She didn't offer an excuse. "A neighbor filmed it on a cell phone. The captain suspended me without pay pending a formal review board. I'm officially a civilian. Bodert leaned against the aluminum skin of the trailer. You pull a gun on an unarmed suspect without a warrant, you don't get a medal. You get a desk. Or fired. I don't care about the desk. I don't care about the badge. Cruz took a step closer. The anger radiating off her was palpable, a live wire snapping in the humid air. I care about the fact that they are burying my sister. Bodert stayed quiet. He let the silence hang, waiting for the rest of it. Her name was Sophia, Cruz continued, the rigid control in her voice cracking just a fraction. She was 24. And she wasn't a cop. She worked the high-end escort circuits. Boca Raton, Delray Beach, Palm Beach Island. The wealthy clients who pay cash to pretend they have a girlfriend for the weekend. When did she go missing? She didn't go missing. They found her body 4 days ago in a cheap motel off Interstate 95. Cruz uncrossed her arms, her hands balling into fists at her sides. The responding officers took one look at her history, saw the location, and wrote it off. They flagged it as a rough John who went too far, or a drug overdose that got out of hand. They processed the scene in 20 minutes and handed the file to a rookie who isn't going to look at it until next month. Bodert scratched the stubble on his jaw. If she worked the high-end circuit, she shouldn't have been in a roadside motel off the interstate. Exactly. Cruz's eyes locked onto his. And overdoses don't arrange themselves. When the maid found her, Sophia was laying perfectly straight on the center of the bed. Her hands were folded neatly over her chest. The room had been wiped down with industrial bleach. And there was a bouquet of cheap carnations sitting in a water glass on the nightstand. Bodert felt a cold, familiar weight settle into his stomach. The tar on his hands was forgotten. The heat pressing down on the concrete slab suddenly felt suffocating. You said she was the first? Bodert asked. I said she was my sister, Cruz corrected sharply. She's the fourth. 3 other working girls have turned up dead in this county over the last 8 months. Different jurisdictions, different motels. Every single one of them was found posed in bed with a bouquet of grocery store carnations. The street calls him Mr. Lonely. The county calls it a statistical anomaly. And you tried to force the fentanyl dealer to give you a lead on the guy. I tried to force the dealer to tell me who bought a specific prepaid burner phone my sister used. He laughed at me. So I shoved a Glock in his teeth. Cruz let out a harsh, bitter breath. And now I'm benched. I can't access the databases. I can't interview witnesses without catching a harassment charge. I'm legally blind. So you drove out to a dirt lot to hire a PI. I didn't drive out here to hire a guy who takes pictures through motel windows, Cruz said, her gaze dropping to the scarred knuckles on Bodert's right hand. I heard the stories about you at the precinct. They say you used to be a deputy. They say you got fired because you didn't know when to stop hitting people. They say you operate entirely off the books. Bodert pushed off the side of the Airstream. He walked over to the Ford, pulled a cooler out of the truck bed, and grabbed 2 bottles of water floating in melting ice. He walked back and held one out to the disgraced detective. She took it, the condensation dripping over her fingers. The cops who told you those stories, Bodert said quietly. Did they also tell you that my methods tend to put the people standing next to me directly in the line of fire? I'm already in the line of fire, Bohannon. My sister is lying on a stainless steel table in the county morgue. She gripped the plastic water bottle so hard, the plastic crinkled loudly. I need your eyes. I need your access. And if we corner this guy, I need someone who isn't going to try to read him his Miranda rights. Bodert looked at Elena Cruz. He saw the grief bleeding through the anger, and the dangerous, reckless momentum of a cop who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He knew exactly what it looked like, because he saw it in the mirror every morning. "Carnations," Bodert said. "Pink ones," Cruz confirmed. Bodert twisted the cap off his water bottle and took a long drink. He looked up at the blistering sun, then back at the half-finished roof of his Airstream. The tar was going to dry unevenly. It was going to leak again during the next storm. It didn't matter. "Where did she work out of?" Bodert asked. Cruz didn't smile, but her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The relief was instantaneous and grim. She paid cash for a condo in Boca. The police already cleared it. They didn't find anything. "The police were looking for a bad date," Bodert said, tossing his water bottle onto the lawn chair next to the tar-stained rag. "Let's go see what a ghost leaves behind." Chapter 2. The Ford's air conditioning compressor had seized up 2 years ago. Bodert drove with both windows rolled down, letting the hot, salty wind off the intracoastal blast through the cab. The radio was off. The only sound was the heavy hum of the mud tires on the asphalt and the rustle of the crime scene photos Elena Cruz was spreading across her lap. She didn't keep them in a neat, tabbed binder. They were loose in a battered manila envelope, heavily creased from being handled with angry, sweating hands. "3 girls before Sophia," Cruz said, raising her voice over the wind. She slapped the first photograph onto the cracked vinyl bench seat between them. "Angela Davis. Found in a night's inn up in Lentana 6 months ago. 19. Independent escort." Bodert glanced down. The girl in the photo lay perfectly straight on a cheap motel mattress. The sheets were pulled up and tucked precisely under her armpits. Her hands were folded together over her stomach, like she was lying in a casket. "Jasmine Reed," Cruz said, dealing the second photo. "Boynton Beach. Found 4 months ago. Same post-mortem staging. Same folded hands." "Riley Vance. West Palm. Found 2 months ago." Cruz dropped the third photo. "Notice the pattern? They look like they're sleeping," Bodert said, keeping his eyes on the road. "No defensive wounds. No torn clothes. The rooms aren't tossed." "The rooms are bleached," Cruz corrected sharply. "Industrial grade, ammonia and bleach." He wipes down the doorknobs, the television remote, the light switches, and the faucets. He strips the carpets. Crime scene techs couldn't pull a single viable fingerprint or a stray hair from any of these locations. He's surgically clean. How does he kill them? Toxicology showed a massive dose of zolpidem in all 3 victims. Ambien. He drugs their drinks, waits for them to pass out, and then he manually strangles them. It takes 3 to 5 minutes of sustained pressure to crush a human windpipe. He sits there and watches them die while they're completely unconscious. Cruz pulled a 4th photograph from the envelope. She held it for a long second, her thumb tracing the white border, before setting it gently next to the others. Sophia. She looked a lot like her older sister. Same dark hair, same sharp jawline, but her features hadn't yet hardened into the cynical armor Cruz wore. Sophia was posed on a queen-sized bed, hands folded, the sheets tucked tight. On the cheap laminate nightstand beside her head sat a clear glass water tumbler holding 6 pink carnations. "The grocery store flowers," Bodert said. "Left at every scene," Cruz said, staring at the picture of her sister. "The department psych profile says it's a marker of remorse. They think he feels guilty after he does it, so he leaves a token." Psych profiles are written by people sitting in air-conditioned offices. It's not remorse. Then what is it? "It's completion," Bodert said. He shifted the truck into 3rd gear, the transmission grinding slightly. He's not hiring a prostitute for an hour. He's setting a stage. The tucked sheets, the clean room, the flowers. He's building a domestic fantasy. He wants to play house. And when the weekend is over, He breaks the dolls and puts them away. Cruz gathered the photos and shoved them back into the envelope. Sophia didn't work street corners. She didn't advertise on the cheap backpage sites. She booked high-end GFE packages. Girlfriend experience. Right. 48 hours minimum. Dinners, shows, staying in the room. The guys who book that want the illusion of a relationship. They want the girl to look at them like they actually matter. Cruz stared out the passenger window at the strip malls blurring past. Sophia screened her clients. She was paranoid. Whoever this guy is, he knows how to look completely harmless on paper. Then we don't look on paper, Bodert said. We look on the street. He whipped the steering wheel hard to the right. The Ford hopped the curb slightly, bouncing on its heavy suspension, and pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of the Pink Flamingo Motel. The building hadn't improved since Bodert's last visit. The coral stucco was still fading, the plastic flamingos on the roof were still missing legs, and the heat still radiated off the blacktop in thick, shimmering waves. Cruz looked at the motel, her hand instinctively dropping to the hem of her shirt, hovering over the concealed Glock. I know this place, Cruz said, her cop instincts flaring instantly. Vice Squad raids this lot twice a year. It's a revolving door for meth and cheap tricks. Leave the gun in the holster, Bodert said, killing the engine. You aren't Vice today. You're a grieving sister. The woman upstairs doesn't talk to badges. They climbed the exterior metal stairs to the second floor. The air was thick and stagnant. Bodert didn't knock on door 24. He pushed straight through the curtain of bone-colored beads. The room smelled exactly the same. Sandalwood, stale cigarette smoke, and cheap gas station perfume. The dark purple fabric still draped the walls, and the heavy velvet cloth covered the small table in the center of the room. Madame Serena sat behind the table, shuffling her tarot deck. She wore a red silk robe today, her dark gray-streaked hair piled loosely on top of her head. She didn't look up when the beads clattered behind them. I didn't hear you pull up, John, Serena said, her husky voice carrying over the soft snick-snick of the cards. But I felt the headache coming from a mile away. She finally looked up, her bourbon-colored eyes sliding past Bodert to lock instantly onto Cruz. Serena's hands went still. The fortune-teller persona vanished, replaced immediately by the cold, calculating stare of a woman who had survived 3 decades in a business that chewed women up and spit them out. You brought a cop into my sanctuary, Serena said. It wasn't a question. She's suspended, Bodert said. Once a cop, always a cop. They carry the iron in their blood. Get her out of here. Her name is Elena Cruz, Bodert said, pulling a folding chair out from the wall. He sat down, ignoring the loud groan of the metal frame. Her little sister was Sophia. Sophia worked the high-end circuit. Somebody strangled her 4 days ago and left pink carnations on the nightstand. Serena looked at Cruz. She took in the dark circles under the detective's eyes, the rigid posture, and the raw, unpolished grief hanging off her like a heavy coat. Serena set the tarot deck down on the velvet cloth. She didn't offer Cruz a chair. Sophia, Serena murmured. The dark hair. Beautiful girl. Kept her nose clean. Never touched the hard stuff, never brought the Johns back to her own place. She was smart. Not smart enough, Cruz said bitterly. She stepped forward, standing directly over the tarot table. You know the streets. You know the girls. I need to know who's booking these weekends and putting them in the ground. If I knew a named detective, he'd already be dead, Serena said smoothly. The working girls in this county talk to each other. When one of us goes missing, the Whisper network lights up. But this guy. She shook her head. He's a ghost. He has to make contact, Bodert said. He has to set up the meets. He doesn't use the regular channels, Serena explained, leaning back in her chair. He doesn't use the broker sites where the girls can verify client history. He targets the independents, the ones who run their own schedules. He books them through encrypted apps, protons, signal drops. He offers triple the going rate for a 48-hour exclusive. Why do they take it? Cruz asked. If it's off the verified books, it's a massive risk. Because it's a massive payout, Serena shot back, her voice hardening. Because rent is due, or the car needs a transmission, or they want to get out of the life and they need a nest egg to do it. And because he doesn't sound dangerous. The girls who survived the initial screening messages said he was incredibly polite, professional. He asked about their boundaries, agreed to all their rules, and offered to pay half the cash up front to a digital wallet. He buys their trust, Bodert said. He buys the illusion, Serena corrected. He pays for the absolute undivided attention of a beautiful woman for 2 days. He wants them to cook for him, sit on the couch and watch movies with him, pretend they are building a life together in whatever generic motel room he rents. Serena picked up a single tarot card from the top of the deck and flipped it face up. The Hermit. An old man standing alone on a dark peak, holding a lantern. But the illusion always shatters, Serena whispered. The weekend ends. The girl starts packing her bag to go home. And the fantasy breaks. He realizes he has to go back to being a nobody. So he slips a pill into her complimentary champagne, tucks her in, and makes sure she never leaves. Cruz stared at the tarot card. The muscle in her jaw was jumping. Sophia had a condo in Boca. If she booked him through an encrypted app, the digital trail is on her phone. The cops searched her condo, Bodert reminded her. They bagged her electronics. They bagged her primary phone, Cruz said, turning to Bodert. Sophia wasn't an amateur. She kept a burner for the high-risk clients. A physical device that never touched the local Wi-Fi. If the uniformed cops did a 20-minute sweep, they wouldn't have found it. Bodert stood up. The metal chair scraped loudly against the floor. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a $50 bill, and dropped it on the velvet table next to the Hermit. For the reading, Bodert said. Serena didn't touch the money. She looked up at him, her eyes dark and serious. He's escalating, John, Serena warned. The gaps between the bodies are getting shorter. He's getting addicted to the fantasy. And the fantasy isn't lasting as long as it used to. You find him, you don't call the badges. You end it. Bodert didn't answer. He turned and pushed through the bead curtain, stepping back out into the suffocating afternoon heat. Cruz followed him down the metal stairs, her boots ringing loudly on the treads. She didn't wait until they reached the truck. You aren't going to try to talk me out of this, are you? Cruz asked, walking fast to keep up with his long stride. When we find him, you aren't going to try to convince me to do the right thing and slap cuffs on him. Bodert unlocked the Ford. He opened the heavy driver's side door and looked at the suspended detective over the rusted roof of the cab. I don't give lectures on morality, Elena. I locate the target. What happens after we find him is entirely up to you. He climbed inside and cranked the engine. Cruz got in the passenger side, pulling the heavy door shut. Bodert threw the truck into gear and pulled out of the pink flamingo lot, pointing the grill south toward Boca Raton. They were going to tear Sophia's condo apart until they found the ghost's digital footprint. Chapter 3. The rusted Ford F-250 did not belong in the underground parking garage of the Azure Tower in Boca Raton. It sat wedged between a pristine white Tesla and a matte black Range Rover, dripping a thin mixture of oil and intracoastal sand onto the polished concrete. Bodert cut the engine. The silence of the subterranean garage was absolute, broken only by the hum of the climate control vents overhead. "Fifth floor," Elena Cruz said. She was already out of the truck, slamming the heavy passenger door shut. Bodert followed her to the elevator bank. They rode up in a glass-walled car that smelled faintly of expensive cedar and ozone. Cruz stared at the brass doors, her reflection hovering over the polished metal. Her hand rested unconsciously on her hip, right above the concealed Glock, her knuckles white. They stepped off onto a floor carpeted in thick, sound-dampening wool. Sophia's condo was at the end of the hall, Unit 512. A strip of bright yellow crime scene tape stretched across the doorframe, officially sealing the residence. The deadbolt lock above the brass handle was covered in a fine dusting of black graphite powder left behind by the forensics team. Cruz reached into her pocket, pulling out a heavy brass key. "I have a spare. She gave it to me a year ago, for emergencies." "Put it away," Bodert said. Cruz frowned. "I'm her sister. I have the right to enter." "You're a suspended detective, currently standing on the wrong side of police tape," Bodert corrected. He stepped in front of the door. "If you put your key in that lock, you break the tape. If the tape is broken, the primary detective knows someone was inside. You leave a footprint, and they charge you with tampering." Bodert pulled a thin silver Zippo lighter and a razor blade from his jeans. He sparked the lighter, holding the flame a few inches beneath the yellow tape where it adhered to the doorframe. He worked it back and forth, softening the heavy adhesive. After 30 seconds, he slid the razor blade under the edge of the tape, peeling it back in one clean, unbroken strip. He stuck the loose end to the adjacent wall. He pulled a set of tension wrenches from his back pocket. "Thought you said breaking the lock leaves a footprint," Cruz whispered, watching the hallway. "I'm not breaking it. I'm just picking it. Uniforms don't dust the internal tumblers." Bodert slid the rake into the keyway, applied torque, and felt the pins click into place. The deadbolt snapped back. He pushed the door open, keeping his hands off the powdered handle. The air inside the condo was stale, carrying the sharp chemical odor of fingerprint dust and the lingering sweet scent of vanilla perfume. The apartment was immaculate. White leather furniture, glass coffee tables, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the Atlantic Ocean. Sophia had built a very expensive, very careful life for herself. Cruz stepped over the threshold. She stopped in the center of the living room, looking at a framed photograph on the mantel. It was the two of them, taken years ago on a beach. Sophia was laughing. Cruz was in uniform, looking directly at the camera with the rigid posture she still hadn't shed. "They tossed the place," Cruz said, her voice dropping into a flat, professional monotone. Bodert saw it too. It was a subtle, institutional mess. The couch cushions were slightly misaligned. The drawers in the glass console table weren't pushed completely shut. A uniformed patrol had swept the rooms, looking for a suicide note, a stash of narcotics, or an angry pimp hiding in a closet. "They didn't tear out the drywall," Bodert said. "They did a 20-minute visual. We need to dig deeper." He moved toward the kitchen. Cruz headed straight for the master bedroom. Bodert started with the obvious secondary hiding spots. He pulled the kick plates off the bottom of the custom cabinetry. Nothing but dust. He checked the freezer, digging past boxes of organic meals to examine the ice maker housing. Empty. He moved to the laundry closet, checking the lint trap and the exhaust hose behind the dryer. "Nothing in the bedroom," Cruz called out. Her voice was tight. They emptied her safe. Took her laptop, her primary phone, her iPad. Bodert walked down the short hallway and stopped in the doorway of the master bath. Cruz was standing in front of a massive double vanity, staring at her own exhausted reflection in the mirror. The countertops were dusted with black powder. "Serena said she was smart," Bodert said, looking up at the ceiling. Smart means she wouldn't hide a client burner where a cop could find it, and she wouldn't hide it where a client could stumble across it if they used the bathroom. Bodert stepped into the room. He climbed onto the closed lid of the toilet, balancing his heavy boots on the porcelain. He reached up to the ceiling exhaust fan. It was a standard, builder-grade plastic square. He dug his fingernails under the plastic edge and pulled straight down. The cover snapped loose, dangling from 2 wire tension springs. Bodert reached his hand up into the dark, dusty cavity of the exhaust housing, feeling along the metal ductwork. His fingers brushed against something soft. He hooked it and pulled it down. It was a small black neoprene pouch, held to the ductwork by a heavy strip of double-sided Gorilla Tape. Bodert hopped down from the toilet. He unzipped the pouch and dumped the contents onto the marble vanity. A sleek black Android smartphone clattered against the stone. Cruz stared at it. The uniforms didn't look up. They rarely do. Bodert picked up the phone and pressed the power button. The screen remained dead black. Battery is drained. Cruz brushed past him, walking back into the bedroom. She opened a nightstand drawer, rummaged through a tangle of cords left behind by the forensics team, and returned with a USB-C charger. She plugged it into an outlet by the sink and slotted the cable into the phone. A white battery icon flashed on the screen. They stood in silence in the sterile bathroom, watching the percentage slowly climb. At 5%, Bodert held the power button down. The phone vibrated, the screen glowing bright white, throwing harsh shadows across Cruz's face. The lock screen appeared. It demanded a 6-digit PIN. Bodert set the phone on the counter and stepped back. Your sister. Your guess. Cruz didn't hesitate. She didn't try a birthday or an anniversary. She reached out and tapped the glass screen with a steady index finger. 100496. The phone unlocked instantly. What was the number? Bodert asked. My badge number, Cruz said quietly. The day I graduated the academy. She was so proud of me, she had it engraved on a watch. She swallowed hard, forcing the memory down into a tight, dark box, and picked up the phone. She swiped past a screen of generic pre-installed apps. There was no social media. No email accounts linked to the device. She found a folder labeled simply, Utilities. Inside was an icon featuring a white padlock. Signal, Cruz said. Encrypted messaging. It burns the messages after they're read, unless you manually override it. She tapped the app. It opened to a completely blank chat history, except for one single active thread pinned to the top. The contact name was listed as Traveler. Cruz opened the thread. She scrolled up. Most of the conversation was missing, likely automatically deleted by the app's timer, but the final logistical exchange had been manually saved by Sophia to preserve the details of the job. Cruz read the glowing text aloud, her voice echoing slightly against the bathroom tile. I prefer to meet in public first, Traveler wrote. I want you to feel completely safe before we spend the weekend together. Just a drink to make sure we're a good fit. That's my policy anyway, Sophia had replied. Where and when? Cut 43. The steakhouse on Palmetto Park Road. Friday night, 8 p.m. I'll be at the corner booth, in the bar. Wear the black dress from your profile picture, so I can spot you. The final message from Sophia simply read, See you at 8 o'clock. Cruz lowered the phone. Cut 43. It's an upscale place. Dark lighting, expensive whiskey caters to the golf course crowd. It's exactly the kind of place a high-end client would pick to look legitimate. He wanted to vet her, Bodert said. He wanted to sit in a booth, watch her walk through the front door, and make sure she didn't bring a boyfriend or a bodyguard. He wanted to make sure she matched the fantasy he was building. And if she didn't match it, he would have just walked out the back door and she never would have known who he was. Cruz turned the screen off and slipped the burner phone into the front pocket of her jeans. She went to the steakhouse on Friday, Bodert said. She met him. She got in his car, and they drove to the motel off the interstate. He turned around and walked out of the bathroom, heading for the front door of the condo. Where are we going? Cruz asked, following close behind him. To order a drink, Bodert said. High-end steakhouses don't rely on trust. They rely on high-definition security cameras. If he sat in a booth at Cut 43, his face is sitting on a hard drive waiting for someone to ask for it. Bodert stepped out into the carpeted hallway. He pulled the door shut until it clicked, then carefully smoothed the yellow crime scene tape back across the frame, pressing the adhesive flat until it looked entirely undisturbed. They walked back to the elevator in silence. The digital ghost had just materialized into a physical location. Mr. Lonely wasn't just a screen name anymore. He was a man who drank in public, and Bodert was going to find out exactly what he looked like. Chapter 4. Cut 43 occupied the anchor suite of an aggressively landscaped strip mall in West Boca. The exterior was designed to look like a Tuscan villa, complete with faux-aged brick and a copper awning. The interior was a shrine to expense accounts. Dark mahogany paneling, oxblood leather booths, and glass-walled wine cellars that stretched from the hardwood floors to the stamped tin ceiling. It was 4 in the afternoon. The dinner rush was an hour away, and the restaurant was locked in that quiet, frantic state of preparation. A crew of busboys polished wine glasses in silence. The heavy, savory smell of dry-aged beef rendering on a hot grill drifted out from the swinging kitchen doors. Bodert and Cruz walked past the empty host stand and headed straight for the bar. The bartender was a young guy in a crisp white shirt and a black vest, meticulously arranging garnishes in a stainless steel tray. He looked up, his professional smile faltering slightly, as he processed Bodert's mud-stained boots and Cruz's uncompromising posture. Bar opens at 5, folks, the bartender said, wiping his hands on a bar towel. I can seat you in the lounge if you want to wait. We aren't here for happy hour, Cruz said. She reached into her back pocket, pulling out a slim leather wallet. She flipped it open, flashing her county badge. She hadn't surrendered it to internal affairs yet. The brass star caught the low amber light. I need to speak to the manager. The bartender's eyes darted to the badge, then back to Cruz's face. The smile vanished entirely. I'll go get Marcus. He disappeared through a heavy wooden door behind the bar. Cruz snapped the wallet shut and shoved it back into her pocket. Impersonating an active officer is a third-degree felony. You only impersonate an officer if you don't actually own the badge, Bodert said, leaning his forearms against the polished mahogany rail. You're just leaning on technicalities. It's what lawyers do for a living. The wooden door swung open. A man in a sharp, tailored gray suit stepped out. He was in his mid-40s, sporting a fresh haircut and a silver tie. He radiated the hyper-vigilant energy of a man whose entire livelihood depended on keeping wealthy, volatile people perfectly content. I'm Marcus, the general manager, he said, stepping up to the bar. He kept his voice low, a confidential murmur designed not to disturb the empty room. How can I help the sheriff's office today? I need to review your security footage from last Friday night, Cruz said. Between 7:30 and 9 o'clock. Marcus steepled his fingers, his face shifting into a mask of polite regret. Detective, I'm happy to cooperate with any official investigation. But company policy requires a subpoena or a warrant to access our digital servers. We host high-profile clients here. Privacy is a cornerstone of our business model. Cruz's jaw tightened. She took a breath, ready to push back, but Bodert cut her off. Privacy is great for business, Marcus, Bodert said, keeping his voice just as low, just as conversational. But police tape is terrible for business. We can walk into your back office right now, review 20 minutes of tape, and walk out the back door without casting a shadow. Or, the detective here can call a patrol supervisor. They'll park 3 marked cruisers right in front of your valet stand, string yellow tape across your faux Tuscan doorway, and hold this restaurant down as an active crime scene right as your Friday dinner rush hits the asphalt. Bodert leaned an inch closer over the mahogany. How much dry-aged beef do you think you're going to sell tonight, with uniforms taking statements in the dining room? Marcus stared at Bodert. He looked at the scarred knuckles resting on his bar, and the flat, dead calm certainty in Bodert's eyes. The manager performed a rapid mental calculation of profit margins versus policy. My office is this way, Marcus said quietly. They followed him through the wooden door, down a short hallway smelling of industrial degreaser, and into a cramped office dominated by a massive digital recording rig. 3 flat-screen monitors glowed above a cluttered desk. Friday night, Marcus said, clicking a mouse. He typed in an administrative password. The screens flickered, bringing up a grid of 16 different camera angles. He clicked on a camera labeled bar area, wide. You said 7:30. Cue it to 7:45, Cruz said, leaning over his shoulder. The timecode in the bottom corner of the screen spun forward. The bar, previously empty in the afternoon, was suddenly packed with a dense, moving crowd of Friday night patrons. Corner booth, Bodert said, tapping the glass of the monitor. Back left. Marcus zoomed the feed. The resolution was high definition, sharp enough to read the labels on the liquor bottles behind the bar. At exactly 7:51 p.m., a man walked into the frame and slid into the corner booth. Cruz leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. The man was a ghost. He wore a nondescript, light gray polo shirt and dark slacks. He was average height, average build, with no distinguishing tattoos or jewelry. He wore a dark baseball cap pulled low over his forehead, the brim casting a deep shadow over the upper half of his face. He sat with his back deliberately angled toward the primary camera hanging over the register. He knows where the lenses are, Bodert murmured. He sat in the blindest spot in the room. A waitress approached the booth on the screen. The man ordered. 3 minutes later, she returned with a tall glass of ice water with a lemon wedge. No alcohol. He's staying sober, Cruz said, her voice tight with suppressed rage. He wants absolute control. At 8:02 p.m., Sophia walked into the frame. She wore the black dress. She looked stunning, her dark hair falling over her shoulders, carrying a small clutch purse. She paused at the edge of the bar, scanning the booths, before spotting the man in the gray polo. She walked over and slid into the booth opposite him. The camera angle was too high and too far away to read lips. But the body language told the entire story. The man didn't lean in aggressively. He didn't reach across the table to touch her hand. He sat perfectly still, radiating a calm, attentive focus. He let Sophia do most of the talking. Whatever he was saying, it was working. After 15 minutes, the rigid, professional posture Sophia carried into the restaurant began to soften. She laughed at something he said, brushing her hair behind her ear. He was selling the illusion, and she was buying it. At 8:28 p.m., the man signaled for the check. He didn't hand the waitress a credit card. He dropped 2 crisp green bills onto the leather folio. Cash. Untraceable. They stood up together and walked out of the frame, heading for the front exit. Switch to the exterior valet camera, Bodert ordered. Marcus clicked the mouse, bringing up the feed from the front curb. The camera looked down over the valet stand and the circular driveway. Sophia and the man walked out the front doors. The man didn't hand a ticket to the valet. He bypassed the stand completely, guiding Sophia toward the open parking lot beyond the restaurant's designated zone. They walked out of the camera's arc, swallowed by the darkness of the Florida night. He didn't use the valet because he didn't want the attendants to see his license plate, Cruz said, staring at the empty screen. He parked off-site. He paid in cash. He kept his face under a brim. Can you isolate a still frame of his face from the bar feed? Bodert asked the manager. Enhance the contrast. Marcus switched back to the interior feed, scrubbed the timeline until the man turned his head slightly to speak to the waitress and captured a still frame. He tweaked the brightness, trying to cut through the shadow of the baseball cap. It didn't help. The man's features were hopelessly generic. A strong jaw, a straight nose. He could have been 35, or he could have been 50. He looked like the guy who fixed your plumbing, or the guy who audited your taxes. He was the most dangerous kind of predator, the one who blended perfectly into the background noise of the city. Print it anyway, Bodert said. Marcus hit a button. A laser printer hummed in the corner, spitting out a grainy black and white page. Bodert took it, folded it in half, and shoved it into his pocket. We're done, Bodert said. They walked back out through the mahogany bar, leaving Marcus standing in the doorway of his office, looking visibly relieved. The heat hit them like a physical wall as they stepped out the faux Tuscan front doors and walked across the asphalt toward the rusted Ford. We didn't get a plate. We didn't get a clear face, Cruz said, her boots striking the pavement in a heavy, angry rhythm. All we know is that he wears cheap polo shirts and pays in cash. We're right back where we started. No, we aren't, Bodert said. He hit the unlock button on his key fob. We know he's disciplined. We know he plans his routes. Guys who are that careful eventually step over their own tripwires. Bodert reached for the door handle of the truck. The sudden, sharp chirp of police sirens sliced through the humid air. Two unmarked Ford Explorers, painted a deep municipal black, whipped into the strip mall parking lot. They didn't park in the designated spots. They accelerated aggressively across the asphalt, angling sharply. One Explorer boxed the front grille of Bodert's F-250. The other screeched to a halt inches from the rear bumper, completely trapping the rusted truck against the curb. 4 doors popped open simultaneously. Bodert didn't draw his weapon. He let his hands fall naturally to his sides, squaring his shoulders to the threat. Cruz froze, her hand dropping instinctively to her hip before she forced it back up. 2 detectives stepped out of the lead Explorer. They wore standard-issue county armor, cheap suits, mirrored sunglasses, and expressions of profound bored irritation. Bodert recognized the breed instantly. They were the guys who spent their days navigating department politics and their nights closing cases with the least amount of paperwork possible. The older detective, a heavy-set man sweating through a tan suit, walked around the hood of his SUV. He pulled off his sunglasses, glaring at Cruz. "Hello, Elena," the detective said. "Miller," Cruz replied, her voice dropping into a dangerous, absolute calm. She nodded at the younger, leaner detective standing beside him. "Hayes, you guys are a long way from the precinct." "We go where the pings tell us to go," Hayes said, adjusting his belt. He had the arrogant smirk of a cop who hadn't been on the job long enough to take a real beating. "IA is monitoring your cell phone, Elena. You're suspended. You're supposed to be sitting in your apartment, thinking about your anger management issues." "I'm taking a walk," Cruz said. "You're visiting the last known location of an active homicide victim," Miller corrected, his voice heavy with forced patience. "You're walking around a crime scene, impersonating an officer, and running your own unauthorized parallel investigation into the Sophia Cruz homicide." "Sophia was my sister. And she's my case," Miller barked, the patience evaporating. He pointed a thick, stubby finger at her chest. "She is evidence on my desk. You are a civilian with a revoked shield. You talk to one more witness. You step over one more piece of tape. I am going to arrest you for obstruction of justice and witness tampering. I will put you in a holding cell, myself, Elena. Don't test me. Hayes stepped out from behind the SUV, closing the distance toward Bodert. He looked the rusted Ford up and down, then locked eyes with Bodert, trying to establish dominance through pure proximity. And who the hell is this? Hayes sneered. This the muscle you hired, Elena. You brought a junkyard dog off his chain to do your heavy lifting. Back up, kid, Bodert said softly. Hayes let out a short, dismissive laugh. He took another step forward, violating Bodert's personal space, reaching out to jab 2 fingers hard into Bodert's chest. I'm a sworn officer of the law, pal. You don't tell me to back up. I'll put you on the concrete right now and run your prints for outstanding. Bodert moved. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't cock his arm back. He brought his left hand up in a blur, caught Hayes's wrist, twisted it sharply outward to lock the joint, and drove his right forearm directly into the young detective's throat. Hayes choked, his eyes bugging out in sudden, blinding shock. Bodert drove him backward, slamming him brutally against the black quarter panel of the Explorer. The heavy metal buckled slightly under the impact. Bodert held him there, pinning the struggling cop to the SUV, applying just enough pressure to the windpipe to make breathing a luxury. Miller dropped his hand to his service weapon, his face going pale. Let him go. Let him go right now. Cruz stepped cleanly between Miller and the Ford, blocking the older detective's line of sight, completely unflinching. Bodert leaned into Hayes's ear, his voice a quiet, abrasive rasp. You have a badge, son. That means you have rules. I don't have a badge anymore. I don't have rules. I don't have a pension. And I don't give a damn about assaulting a police officer. You touch me again, I will break your wrist and beat you unconscious with your own handcuffs. Nod if you understand the physics of the situation. Hayes, his face turning a mottled purple, managed a frantic, jerky nod. Bodert released the wrist and stepped back, letting his arms drop to his sides. Hayes slid down the side of the Explorer, coughing violently, rubbing his throat. Miller didn't draw his weapon. He stared at Bodert, recognizing the absolute lack of hesitation in the man's eyes. He knew a rabid dog when he saw one. You're making a massive mistake, Elena, Miller said, his voice shaking slightly as he backed toward his open door. Both of you. The captain isn't going to look the other way on this. Tell the captain I'm busy, Cruz said. Miller grabbed Hayes by the collar of his cheap suit, hauling the younger cop into the passenger seat. They climbed into the Explorers, threw them into reverse, and tore out of the strip mall, tires squealing in angry protest against the hot asphalt. Bodert watched them go, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. The violent spike of adrenaline began to recede. He turned around, resting his hand on the door handle of his truck. He glanced across the 4 lanes of Palmetto Park Road. The afternoon traffic was heavy, a steady stream of luxury sedans and landscaping trucks. But parked on the far shoulder, sitting in the deep shade of a massive banyan tree, was a dark gray mid-sized sedan. The windows were heavily tinted, but the driver's side window was rolled down exactly 3 inches. Protruding through that narrow gap, resting on the glass, was the long, black cylindrical barrel of a telephoto camera lens. The glass of the lens flared briefly, catching the dying afternoon sun, aimed directly at Bodert and Cruz. Bodert didn't point. He didn't alert Cruz. He just stared back at the lens, across the river of traffic. The camera slid smoothly back into the car. The dark window rolled up, sealing the cabin. The gray sedan pulled away from the curb, sliding seamlessly into the flow of traffic, vanishing into the endless sea of Florida commuters. What is it? Cruz asked, noticing his shift in focus. She followed his gaze toward the road, but there was nothing left to see. We didn't get his plate, Bodert said quietly, opening the heavy door of his truck. But he just got ours. We aren't hunting a ghost anymore, Elena. He knows exactly who we are. Chapter 5. The paranoia settled over the dirt track like a heavy blanket. Bodert sat in a rusted lawn chair outside the Airstream, a cup of black coffee going cold in his hand. It was 2 a.m. The moon was a thin, useless sliver hidden behind high drifting clouds. He watched the dark road leading back to the highway, waiting for a pair of headlights that didn't come. Elena Cruz paced the length of the concrete slab. She had been walking the same tight, angry circuit for 2 hours, burning off the adrenaline from the confrontation with Miller and Hayes. If he knows my face, he knows I'm suspended, Cruz said, her boots crunching on the loose limestone. If he ran your plates, he knows you're an unlicensed civilian with a violence jacket. We don't have institutional cover. He's not afraid of us. He took our picture because he's a voyeur, Bodert said, keeping his eyes on the tree line. He likes watching from a safe distance. It gives him the illusion of control. It's not an illusion if he knows where we sleep. Bodert's cell phone vibrated against the aluminum fold-down table inside the open trailer door. The low, mechanical buzz cut through the drone of the cicadas. Cruz stopped pacing instantly. Her hand dropped to her waist. Bodert stood up, leaving the coffee on the lawn chair, and walked inside. He checked the caller ID. He answered it on speaker, setting the phone back on the table. Serena, Bodert said. She missed the check-in, the psychic said. Her voice was stripped of its usual, husky amusement. It was flat, urgent, and vibrating with an ugly certainty. Name is Tanya. 22. Independent. She booked a 48-hour exclusive starting yesterday afternoon. She promised her roommate she'd send a proof-of-life text every 12 hours. When was the last text? 2 hours ago. The roommate tried calling. It goes straight to voicemail. Tanya is meticulous about her safety protocols, John. She doesn't sleep through alarms. Cruz leaned over the table, bracing her weight on her hands. Did she drop a pin before the phone went dark? She sent a GPS coordinate to her roommate right when she arrived at the location, Serena confirmed. I'm texting it to you now. It's way out west. Loxahatchee. Past the agricultural reserve. The phone chirped, displaying a text message with a string of numbers. Don't call the county yet, Bodert told Serena. I'm not calling anyone but you, she replied. The line went dead. Bodert grabbed the keys to the Ford off the counter. He didn't say a word to Cruz. He didn't have to. They both knew exactly what a missed check-in meant on a 48-hour booking with a ghost. They made the drive in 40 minutes, pushing the rusted F-250 well past its comfortable cruising speed. The coordinates pulled them away from the coastal wealth and deep into the geographic margins of Palm Beach County. The streetlights vanished. The paved highway degraded into a heavily patched 2-lane road, flanked by deep drainage canals and dense black walls of sugarcane. The GPS pin stopped at the entrance of a sprawling, bankrupt residential development called Cypress Hollow. It was a monument to the housing crash. A massive brick entrance gate stood completely devoid of landscaping or brass lettering. The roads winding through the subdivision were paved, but weeds pushed up through the asphalt in thick, ragged clumps. There were fire hydrants, but no houses. Just rows of poured concrete foundations sitting in the swamp, waiting for framing lumber that had never arrived. Drive to the back, Cruz said, scanning the empty moonlit lots. A predator doesn't hunt near the entrance. Bodert navigated the maze of empty streets, the truck's headlights sweeping across the desolate infrastructure. Deep in the back of the development, isolated at the end of a long cul-de-sac, sat a single, completed house. It was a massive, 2-story stucco box. A McMansion built as a model home before the developer's credit line evaporated. The yard was a chaotic mess of overgrown sawgrass. Bodert killed the headlights and let the truck coast to a stop 2 houses down. "Dark?" Cruz whispered. "Not completely," Bodert noted. He pointed through the windshield. The heavy insulated hurricane windows were pitch black, but the low mechanical hum of a 5-ton air conditioning compressor vibrated through the humid night air. The house had active power. They stepped out of the truck. The silence of the abandoned subdivision was heavy and oppressive. Cruz drew her Glock, holding it low against her right thigh. Bodert unholstered the Sig Sauer. They moved up the cracked driveway together. A large, heavy-duty electronic lockbox hung from the brass handle of the front door. It was the kind real estate agents used, requiring a Bluetooth ping or a rolling numeric code to release the house keys. Bodert reached out and tested the handle. Locked tight. No signs of forced entry. No pry marks on the jamb. "He had the code," Cruz murmured, staring at the box. Bodert motioned toward the side of the house. They moved through the overgrown grass, keeping tight to the stucco wall, and rounded the corner to the back patio. The sliding glass door facing the undug backyard pool was shut. Bodert didn't bother checking the lock. He raised his heavy right boot and drove his heel squarely into the center of the glass pane near the latch mechanism. The tempered glass didn't shatter into shards. It exploded inward in a shower of tiny, harmless cubes, hitting the tile floor inside with a sound like falling ice. He reached through the hole, flipped the latch, and slid the door open. The smell hit them before they even crossed the threshold. It was a violent, suffocating wave of industrial-grade bleach and ammonia, burning the inside of Bodert's nose. But underneath the harsh chemicals lay something infinitely worse. The heavy, greasy scent of cheap fast food. Bodert swept his flashlight across the room, keeping the beam tight. The house was completely unfurnished. Bare drywall, pristine tile floors echoing empty space. They cleared the living room and the kitchen in 10 seconds. Cruz stopped dead at the entrance to the formal dining room. Bodert brought the light up. A cheap, plastic folding card table had been set up directly under the crystal chandelier. 2 mismatched metal folding chairs sat opposite each other. Tanya was sitting in the chair, facing the doorway. She was 22, wearing a silk evening dress that pooled on the dusty tile floor. Her head was slumped forward, her chin resting on her chest. Her hands were pulled up and folded neatly on the plastic tabletop, resting right next to a waxy paper wrapper containing a half-eaten fast food hamburger. The table was perfectly set for 2. Another burger sat on the opposite side, next to a neat pile of French fries. In the direct center of the plastic table, shoved into a large, clear McDonald's soda cup, was a bouquet of bright pink carnations. Cruz let out a ragged, shaking breath. Her gun hand trembled slightly. The sheer, grotesque domesticity of the scene was a psychological gut punch. It wasn't just a murder. It was a pathetic, meticulously arranged dinner date with a corpse. Bodert kept the flashlight steady. He walked into the dining room, his boots crunching on the loose glass he had tracked in from the patio. He stopped next to Tanya. He didn't check for a pulse. The lividity pooling in her bare arms told him she had been dead for hours. He changed the pattern, Cruz whispered, her voice tight, fighting the urge to completely unravel. He posed them in bed before. Sleeping. Now he's posing them at a table. He's escalating the fantasy, Bodert said. He swept the flashlight beam over the pristine, bleach-stained tile floor. He doesn't want them sleeping anymore. He wants them awake. He wants a companion. When she passed out from the drugs, he dressed her, dragged her out here, and propped her up so they could eat together. Bodert moved the light to the empty chair opposite the dead girl. The seat of the metal folding chair was wiped completely clean. The fast food wrapper on that side of the table was crumpled, the burger fully eaten. He had sat there. He had eaten his dinner while watching her cool. The lockbox, Cruz said suddenly, turning away from the table, desperate to focus on the mechanics of the crime rather than the victim. He didn't break in. He walked right through the front door. And the AC is running. The power company doesn't leave the grid active on a bankrupt, foreclosed property for 3 years. Someone has to authorize the utilities to keep the drywall from rotting, Bodert noted. He walked back into the kitchen, shining his light on a small white sticker plastered to the inside of the electrical breaker box. It was a county inspection log. A grid of dates and initials, proving the property was being routinely checked for structural integrity and mold remediation. The most recent date scrawled in black ink was yesterday. He's not a ghost, Bodert said quietly. He's an inspector, a bank auditor, a property manager. He has the gate codes, the lockbox combinations, and the authority to turn the power on in hundreds of empty houses across the state. Cruz stared at the sticker. The realization hit her, solidifying the terrifying scope of the man's hunting grounds. He didn't need to lure girls to his own home. He had an endless supply of pristine, isolated, untraceable mansions at his disposal. A sharp, rising wail cut through the silence of the swamp. Sirens. Bodert killed the flashlight instantly, plunging the house back into absolute darkness. He moved to the kitchen window, looking out toward the main highway bordering the subdivision. 2 sets of red and blue strobes were tearing down the asphalt, turning onto the unlit entrance road of Cypress Hollow. They're coming fast, Bodert said. Serena wouldn't call them, Cruz said, her gun coming up to the ready position. Serena didn't. He did. Bodert turned back toward the dining room. It's part of his ritual. He finishes his dinner, cleans his mess, walks out the front door, and calls it in from a burner phone so his handiwork gets an audience. The sirens grew louder, echoing off the empty concrete foundations lining the desolate streets. They had less than 2 minutes before the cruisers hit the cul-de-sac. We have to go, Elena, Bodert said. Cruz didn't move. She stood in the dark dining room, staring at the silhouette of the dead girl slumped at the plastic table. To run meant leaving another victim behind for Miller and Hayes to process and bury in a filing cabinet. Bodert crossed the room, grabbed Cruz by the shoulder of her t-shirt, and hauled her physically toward the shattered back patio door. The uniforms catch us standing over a fresh body. You go to a county cell, and I go to a state penitentiary, Bodert hissed in her ear. And the guy who bought those carnations gets to go to work tomorrow morning and pick out a new house. Move. He shoved her through the broken glass door. They sprinted across the overgrown backyard, bypassing the rusted Ford parked out front. They hit the tree line just as the first marked county cruiser skidded to a halt in the driveway, its spotlight sweeping across the stucco facade of the McMansion. Bodert dragged Cruz deep into the sawgrass and the dense pines. They circled wide, navigating the flooded drainage ditch in the dark, soaking their boots in stagnant water, moving silently back toward the truck while the deputies breached the front door with flashlights drawn. The ghost wasn't invisible anymore. He had a profession. He had a routine. Bodert hit the unlock button on the Ford from the shadows. The hunt had just fundamentally changed directions. Chapter 6. Bodert kept the Ford's headlights off until they were 2 miles clear of the bankrupt subdivision. He navigated the unlit agricultural roads by the ambient glow of the moon reflecting off the black water of the drainage canals. In the passenger seat, Elena Cruz was vibrating. It wasn't fear. It was a dark, radioactive cocktail of adrenaline and unfiltered rage. She kept her Glock gripped tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale in the dim cab, staring straight ahead through the bug-splattered windshield. He sat across from her, Cruz said. Her voice was a tight, abrasive whisper. He posed her like a mannequin, unwrapped his food, and he ate dinner while she went cold. "He's playing a game," Bodert said, finally reaching up to pull the headlight switch. The yellow beams cut through the swamp fog. "He's an inspector. He has access to 1,000 empty dining rooms. The real estate is free, so he spends his money on the illusion." Serena said he pays triple the going rate for the weekend exclusives. He wires half the cash up front to a digital wallet. Cruz finally holstered her weapon, turning her head to look at him. A guy driving a county inspection truck doesn't have $60,000 in liquid cash to spend on dead escorts every year. He's moving money through a pipeline. "Which means we need a plumber," Bodert said. He didn't drive back to the coast. He aimed the truck south, staying inland, hugging the edge of the Everglades, until the sprawling equestrian estates of Wellington began to break through the darkness. By the time Bodert turned the heavy Ford onto the shell rock driveway of Wade Crawley's ranch, the sky in the east was bleeding from pitch black to a bruised violet gray. The main gates were chained open. The massive Spanish Revival house sat quiet at the end of the oak-lined drive. Bodert bypassed the front entrance and drove straight around back toward the stables. Crawley was already awake. The ex-smuggler sat on a teakwood deck chair by the keyhole-shaped pool, a mug of coffee resting on his massive, scarred knee. He wore a faded bathrobe over board shorts. One of the Capuchin monkeys sat on the patio table beside him, meticulously peeling a green grape. Crawley didn't flinch when the rusted truck rattled to a stop on the flagstones. He just took a slow sip of his coffee. "You only drive out here before dawn when you're bleeding or you're hunting, John," Crawley called out. "I don't see any fresh bullet holes in your truck." "So, who are we hunting?" Bodert stepped out of the cab. Cruz followed, hanging back a half step, her eyes scanning the sprawling property and the massive man sitting by the glowing turquoise water. "I need a name, Wade," Bodert said, walking up to the edge of the pool. "Someone handling digital escrow for the high-end working girls. The encrypted apps. The off-the-books transactions." Crawley looked at Bodert, then shifted his pale blue eyes to Cruz. He recognized the rigid posture and the sharp, assessing gaze instantly. "You brought a cop onto my property," Crawley noted, his voice dropping an octave. "She's suspended," Bodert said. "And her sister is dead. We aren't here for your ledgers." Crawley held Cruz's stare for a long moment, evaluating the raw, jagged grief sitting just behind her eyes. He reached into the pocket of his bathrobe, pulled out a single peanut, and tossed it to the monkey. "The high-end independent girls don't manage their own digital security," Crawley said, turning his attention back to Bodert. "It's too complicated. The crypto tumblers, the burner routing numbers. They use a middleman. A digital pimp who takes 20% off the top to make sure the IRS and the vice squads never see the deposits." "Who runs the local network?" "A kid named Julian Vane. Goes by Jules." Crawley picked up his coffee mug. "He thinks he's a Silicon Valley disruptor, but he's just a bottom feeder with a decent Wi-Fi connection. He brokers the meets, handles the escrow, and scrubs the digital footprints when the weekend is over." "Where do I find him?" "He operates out of the VIP lounge at a strip club in Fort Lauderdale. The Neon Orchid on Federal Highway. It's a miserable place. The floors are sticky, and the bouncers carry cheap guns." Crawley looked up at Bodert. "Jules is arrogant. He isn't going to hand over his client list just because you ask nicely." "I rarely ask nicely," Bodert said. He turned and walked back to the truck. The Neon Orchid was an ugly, windowless concrete block, painted matte black. A massive pink neon sign buzzed angrily above the reinforced steel front door, half the letters burned out, so it simply read, Neo Orc. It was 11 in the morning. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few beat-up sedans and a matte white Porsche Panamera parked diagonally across two handicapped spaces. "That's Jules," Cruz said, staring at the Porsche as Bodert parked the Ford. "A guy skimming 20% off escort escrow doesn't drive a Civic." Bodert killed the engine. "You let me do the talking inside." Cruz's jaw tightened. "Sophia was my sister." "And Jules knows exactly how to handle angry cops," Bodert countered, pulling his keys from the ignition. "He deals with vice detectives, trying to shake him down every month. You flash your empty badge wallet at him, he's going to laugh, call his lawyer, and walk out the back door. You let me work." Bodert stepped out of the truck. The brutal midday sun baked the asphalt, but the second they pulled open the heavy steel door of the club, the temperature plummeted 20 degrees. The interior of the Neon Orchid smelled like stale beer, bleach, and cheap vanilla body spray. The main room was completely empty. A single bartender polished glasses behind a long laminate counter. Off to the right, a velvet rope blocked a set of carpeted stairs leading to a raised VIP mezzanine. A bouncer the size of a commercial refrigerator stood at the base of the stairs. He wore a tight black t-shirt that stretched over heavily tattooed biceps. He crossed his arms as Bodert and Cruz approached. "Club's closed," the bouncer grunted. "Come back at 4. Bodert didn't slow his stride. "I'm looking for Jules." "Jules is busy. Turn around." Bodert stopped inches from the velvet rope. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike a fighting stance. He just looked up at the bouncer with absolute, dead calm certainty. "You make $12 an hour to stand by this rope," Bodert said softly. "I'm going to unhook it. If you put your hand on me, I am going to shatter your kneecap, and you are going to spend the rest of your life walking with a cane. Step aside." The bouncer looked into Bodert's eyes. He saw the cold, mechanical reality of the threat. He looked at Cruz, saw the rigid, lethal tension radiating off her, and performed the easiest math of his life. The bouncer took one step to the left. Bodert unhooked the velvet rope and walked up the carpeted stairs. The VIP lounge was a semicircle of curved leather booths overlooking the empty main stage. Julian Vane sat in the center booth. He was in his late 20s, wearing a silk shirt unbuttoned to his sternum, his hair slicked back with heavy product. He sat behind an open MacBook Pro, rapidly typing on the keyboard. He didn't look up as they approached. "I told you, Marcus, nobody comes up here until the afternoon shift." Bodert slid into the booth opposite Jules. Cruz stood at the edge of the table, blocking the exit. Jules stopped typing. He looked up, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly as he processed the mud caked on Bodert's jeans and the intense, furious glare of the woman standing over him. "Who the hell are you?" Jules demanded, slamming the laptop shut. "This is a private area." "My name is Bohannon," Bodert said. "You broker the escrow for independent girls using encrypted messaging apps. I need a routing number for one of your clients." Jules let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. He leaned back in the leather booth, instantly regaining his bravado. "You've got to be kidding me. You look like a guy who fixes air conditioners. And you," he pointed at Cruz. "You reek of cheap coffee and institutional policy. You're a cop. Where's your warrant? Because without a piece of paper signed by a judge, you can both turn around and walk right back down those stairs." Cruz took a step forward, her hand dropping toward her holster. Bodert shot his left hand across the table in a blur. He grabbed Jules by the collar of his silk shirt and hauled him violently forward. The laptop crashed to the floor. Bodert dragged Jules face first across the sticky table, pinning him flat against the laminate. Bodert drew the Sig Sauer with his right hand and pressed the heavy steel barrel directly against the bridge of Jules's nose. The smirk vanished. Jules gasped, his hand scrambling uselessly against the tabletop. "I'm not a cop," Bodert whispered. His voice was a rasping, mechanical scrape. I don't need a warrant. I need a routing number. You're crazy, Jules choked out, his eyes crossing as he stared at the muzzle of the gun. I don't know who you're looking for. Sophia Cruz, Angela Davis, Jasmine Reed, Riley Vance, Tanya. Bodert applied a fraction more pressure with the gun barrel. They're dead, Jules. All of them. And the man who killed them paid his deposits through your servers. Jules's face went completely white. The bravado shattered, replaced by naked, suffocating panic. I didn't know. I swear to God. I just processed the transfers. I don't meet the clients. I don't know their real names. He doesn't use a real name, Cruz spat, leaning over the table, her face inches from Jules's ear. He uses a corporate account. He's a property inspector. What is the name of the shell company? I can't, Jules whimpered. The encryption. Bodert cocked the hammer of the cig. The sharp click echoed loudly in the empty club. Apex. Jules screamed, squeezing his eyes shut. Apex Structural Audits. That's the routing name on the deposits. It's a localized LLC. They wire the funds to the blockchain, and I disperse it to the girls' digital wallets. That's all I know. I swear. Bodert held him pinned to the table for 3 long seconds, letting the absolute terror solidify in the broker's mind. Then he slowly decocked the weapon and released Jules's collar. Jules scrambled backward, pressing himself deep into the corner of the leather booth, his hands shaking violently as he touched the red welt forming on the bridge of his nose. Bodert stood up. He holstered the cig beneath his canvas jacket. You're going to shut down your servers today, Jules, Bodert said calmly. You're going to empty your accounts, pack a bag, and you're going to find a new career. If I ever hear about you brokering another meet in this county, I will come back here, and I won't ask questions. Jules nodded frantically, his breathing shallow and rapid. Bodert turned and walked toward the stairs. Cruz hesitated for a fraction of a second, staring at the broker with absolute disgust, before turning to follow Bodert down to the main floor. The massive bouncer at the bottom of the stairs didn't say a word as they walked past him. They pushed through the heavy steel door, stepping back out into the blinding Florida sun. The heat felt clean compared to the air inside the club. Cruz walked toward the Ford, her boots striking the pavement hard. Apex Structural Audits. It's a registered business. That means it has a tax ID, a listed director, and a physical address. It means he's paying taxes on the money he uses to buy the carnations, Bodert said. He unlocked the truck. We don't need the police database anymore. We just need the Public Records Office. Chapter 7. The State of Florida Division of Corporations website was a digital equalizer. It didn't care if you were a billionaire hiding assets or a disgraced detective hunting a killer. If you registered a business in the state, your name went into the public database. Bodert and Cruz sat side by side at a public computer terminal in the downtown West Palm Beach library. The air conditioning was aggressive, smelling of old paper and carpet cleaner. A few tables over, a man in a tattered coat slept soundly over a newspaper. Cruz's fingers flew across the sticky plastic keyboard. She bypassed the municipal search portals she no longer had authorized access to and went straight to Sunbuzz. She typed Apex Structural Audits into the search bar and hit enter. The screen blinked, loading a sterile, text-heavy page. Active, Cruz murmured, leaning closer to the monitor. Formed 3 years ago. She scrolled down to the registered agent and officer details. The corporate mailing address was a generic P.O. box in a strip mall off Okeechobee Boulevard. But the state required a physical address for the managing member. There was only one name listed. Arthur Vance. Vance, Bodert said quietly. He stared at the name on the glowing screen. That was the last name of the third victim, Riley Vance, the one found in West Palm 2 months ago. Cruz's jaw muscles flexed. It's not a coincidence. He used his own surname as a sick joke, or he specifically targeted a girl who shared it just to see if the detectives connecting the dots would notice the overlap. They didn't. She clicked on the physical address linked to Arthur Vance. It was an apartment complex in Lake Worth, a densely packed block of 2-story stucco buildings, favored by transient renters and seasonal workers. He's a ghost living in plain sight, Cruz said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She pulled a pen from her pocket and wrote the address on the back of a library receipt. He contracts with the major banks. Foreclosure upkeep. He changes the locks, drains the pools, and signs off on the electrical grid so the drywall doesn't rot before they can auction the properties. It gives him the gate codes to half the empty mansions in the county, Bodert said. And it gives him the perfect cover to drive around upscale neighborhoods in a generic truck without drawing a single look from private security. Cruz shoved the receipt into her pocket and stood up, pushing the heavy wooden chair back. Lake Worth is 20 minutes south. We can hit his apartment before the afternoon traffic chokes Interstate 95. Bodert didn't move from the monitor. He reached out and placed his hand over the computer mouse. We aren't kicking down an apartment door in broad daylight, Elena. He's sitting right there, she hissed, her hand dropping instinctively toward the hem of her shirt. We have an address. We have his name. And he knows we're looking. He took our picture from the gray sedan outside the steakhouse. If we roll up to his apartment complex in a rusted F-250 he already recognizes, we lose the only advantage we have left. Bodert stood up. We need to drop the truck. We take your Civic. It's generic. It blends in. Cruz stared at him, the aggressive forward momentum fighting against her tactical training. She knew he was right, but the proximity to the man who murdered her sister was burning a hole in her stomach. Fine, she said finally. We go back to your lot. We take my car. But we do it today. They walked out of the quiet, sterile library and back into the suffocating, humid reality of the Florida afternoon. The sky above the Intracoastal was a flat, blinding white. Bodert drove the Ford back out toward the dirt track, putting the city behind them. The scrub oaks and palmettos grew thicker, the pavement giving way to crushed limestone and deep sand ruts. The Airstream came into view, gleaming dull silver at the center of the poured concrete slab. Bodert eased his foot off the accelerator. The truck crawled forward, the tires crunching loudly. Stop the truck, Cruz said. Bodert hit the brakes. The Ford rocked to a halt, 50 yards from the edge of the slab. Cruz wasn't looking at the Airstream. She was staring at her faded silver Honda Civic, parked exactly where she had left it that morning. Sitting dead center on the hood of the Civic was a bright, jarring splash of color. Bodert shifted the truck into park. He didn't turn off the engine. He drew the Sig Sauer from his shoulder holster, keeping it low below the dashboard, his eyes sweeping the dense wall of scrub oak surrounding the lot. Stay in the cab, Bodert ordered. Cruz ignored him. She threw her door open and stepped out onto the dirt track. She didn't draw her Glock. She walked toward the Honda Civic with slow, heavy steps, her eyes locked entirely on the hood of the car. Bodert slid out of the truck, the Sig gripped tight in his right hand. He tracked the tree line, watching for the metallic glint of a telephoto lens or the dark muzzle of a rifle. The woods were dead quiet. Nothing moved, but the heat shimmering over the sand. He moved up behind Cruz, stopping right at the front bumper of the Civic. The plastic wrapper crinkled slightly in the hot breeze. Inside the clear plastic sat a half-dozen pink carnations. They were fresh. The stems were still bright green, the petals unbruised. The sickeningly sweet, generic smell of the grocery store flowers hit Bodert's nose, completely cutting through the scent of the nearby ocean. Tucked neatly between the green stems, resting flat against the plastic, was a single Polaroid photograph. Cruz stared at the flowers. Her hands were shaking. She reached out, her fingers pale and stiff, and pulled the Polaroid free from the wrapper. Bodert stepped closer, looking over her shoulder. The photograph wasn't a crime scene shot. It hadn't been printed from a police file. It was an original, chemical instant print. Sophia stared out from the glossy square. She was sitting on the edge of a cheap motel bed. She wore the black dress from the steakhouse. Her makeup was perfect, but her eyes were wide, dark, and utterly terrified. She was looking directly into the camera lens. Her hands were gripped tight around the edge of the mattress, the knuckles white. She looked completely paralyzed. The background of the photo was the motel room walls, wiped impeccably clean. It was a photograph taken by a man who was thoroughly enjoying the absolute control he held over the woman in front of him. It was a trophy. Cruz didn't scream. She didn't drop the picture. The shaking in her hands suddenly stopped, replaced by a terrifying absolute stillness. She stared at her sister's terrified face, absorbing every pixel of the nightmare Arthur Vance had constructed. Bodert looked down at the hood of the car. There was a thin film of dust covering the silver paint, disturbed only where the plastic wrapper had been placed. There were no fingerprints, no smudges. Vance had walked right up to the car, set the trap, and vanished back into the scrub. "He followed us from Boca," Bodert said quietly, keeping his eyes on the tree line. "He wanted us to know he could have put a bullet through the windshield of the truck, but he chose to leave a message instead." Cruz slowly lowered the photograph. She didn't look at Bodert. She looked at the rusted Airstream, the empty concrete slab, and the desolate, isolated stretch of dirt road. "He's not running," Cruz whispered. Her voice was stripped of all its previous heat, leaving behind something cold, hard, and entirely lethal. "He knows exactly who we are. He knows where you sleep. He's inviting us to come find him." She reached down, grabbed the plastic wrapper of pink carnations off the hood of her car, and threw it onto the dirt. She crushed the flowers beneath the heel of her boot, grinding the petals into the sand. Cruz opened the driver's side door of the Civic. She tossed the Polaroid onto the passenger seat. "You wanted to take my car," Cruz said, looking at Bodert over the roof of the Honda. The grief was gone. Only the wrecking ball remained. Get in. Chapter 8. Elena Cruz drove the Honda Civic like it was a weapon. She kept the speedometer pinned at 85, down the center lane of Interstate 95, weaving through the heavy afternoon traffic with short, violent jerks of the steering wheel. She didn't use her turn signals. She didn't look at the rearview mirror. Bodert sat in the passenger seat, his right hand gripping the plastic grab handle above the window. He didn't tell her to slow down. Telling an angry cop to check her speed was a waste of breath. "He's not going to be there," Bodert said over the roar of the wind through the cracked windows. "We have his registered address," Cruz shot back, her eyes locked on the brake lights ahead. "He's arrogant. He left the picture on my car to show us he's untouchable. Arrogant guys don't run. They stay home and wait. He's a ghost, Elena. He spent 3 years building a life that leaves 0 fingerprints. The second he realized we were tracking him, he started burning the bridges. We aren't driving to an ambush. We're driving to a vacuum." Cruz ignored him. She took the 10th Avenue exit in Lake Worth entirely too fast, the Civic's tires screaming in protest as she whipped the wheel hard to the right. The apartment complex was a U-shaped, 2-story block of faded pink stucco built around a central courtyard. The courtyard featured a kidney-shaped swimming pool that had been drained years ago, its concrete basin cracked and choked with dead palm fronds. The air smelled of low tide, stale beer, and hot asphalt. Cruz parked the Civic diagonally across 2 spaces near the front office. She cut the engine and stepped out, the Glock already drawn and pressed tight against her right thigh. "Put the gun away," Bodert ordered, stepping out into the crushing heat. "We're hitting a murder suspect's residence. We're standing in a courtyard, surrounded by 40 windows. You walk up those stairs with a weapon drawn. Somebody is going to dial 911 before we even reach the landing. We don't have badges to wave at the responding officers. Hide it." Cruz's jaw clenched. She hesitated, the tactical imperative warring with the furious sister inside her head. But she finally slid the Glock into the Kydex holster at her waist and pulled the hem of her black t-shirt over the grip. They walked up the rusted metal staircase to the second floor. Unit 204 was at the far end of the exterior walkway. The door was painted appealing, institutional brown. A cheap welcome mat sat out front, worn completely flat. Bodert stepped up to the jamb. He reached into his back pocket for his tension wrenches, but stopped. The deadbolt wasn't engaged. The door was resting a fraction of an inch ajar. Bodert drew the Sig Sauer, holding it close to his chest. He looked at Cruz. She nodded once, her hand resting on the hidden grip of her Glock, her body bladed toward the doorway. Bodert raised his left boot and kicked the door right above the handle. The door flew open, crashing against the interior drywall. Bodert went in low, slicing the angle with the heavy steel barrel of the Sig. Cruz came in right behind him, moving with the fluid, practiced grace of a SWAT breach, hooking right to clear the kitchen while Bodert took the living room. "Clear," Cruz barked. "Clear," Bodert echoed. He lowered the gun. He had been right. They hadn't driven to an ambush. They had driven to a vacuum. The apartment was entirely stripped. The cheap beige carpet held the deep, rectangular indentations of furniture that had been recently removed, but the rooms were bare. No couch, no television, no dishes in the sink. The walls had been wiped down. The air smelled of industrial bleach and ammonia, the exact same chemical signature they had choked on inside the model home at Cypress Hollow. Vance hadn't just moved out. He had sterilized his own life. Cruz walked into the empty master bedroom. She kicked open the closet doors. Nothing but wire hangers rattling on a metal rod. "He's gone," Cruz said, walking back into the living room. The disappointment in her voice was heavy and bitter. "He burned the identity. He pulled his cash out of the shell company, packed a bag, and walked away. We have absolutely nothing left to track." Bodert didn't answer. He was staring at the kitchen counter. Sitting dead center on the cheap laminate, completely alone in the sterilized apartment, was a black plastic prepaid burner phone. Bodert walked over to the counter. The phone was plugged into a wall outlet, its screen dark. He didn't touch it. He just stared at the small black rectangle, waiting. 10 seconds later, the screen lit up. The phone began to vibrate violently against the laminate, playing a cheerful, generic ringtone. Cruz stepped up beside him, her hand hovering over her weapon. "Don't answer it." Bodert reached out and pressed the green button. He didn't put the phone to his ear. He hit the speaker icon and set it back down on the counter. "Vance," Bodert said. "John," a voice replied. It was a chillingly ordinary voice. It didn't sound psychotic. It didn't sound threatening. It sounded like a bank teller, politely explaining an overdraft fee. It was the voice of a man who could talk a terrified, drugged woman into feeling safe right before he strangled her. "I'm glad you made it," Vance said smoothly. "I left the door unlocked for you. I assume Elena is standing right there beside you." Cruz leaned over the counter, her eyes burning. "I'm going to find you, you sick son of a bitch. I'm going to find you, and I am going to put a bullet between your eyes for what you did to Sophia." Vance let out a soft, genuine sigh. I liked Sophia. I really did. She was attentive. She understood the assignment. It's a shame she couldn't stay. But I suppose we all have to move on eventually. Speaking of moving on, I really wouldn't linger in that apartment. Bodert's eyes snapped toward the open front door. What did you do, Arthur? I didn't do anything, John. I just made a phone call. The young men who sell methamphetamine out of Unit 102 are highly territorial. I called them 5 minutes ago. I told them a rival crew was currently raiding my apartment to steal the $50,000 I keep hidden in the drywall. The line clicked and went dead. Bodert lunged across the counter, grabbing Cruz by the shoulder and hauling her violently toward the floor. Get down. The front doorway exploded. A 12-gauge shotgun blast tore through the cheap hollow-core doorframe, filling the living room with a deafening concussive roar. Splinters of wood and chunks of drywall rained down over their heads. Bodert hit the beige carpet hard, rolling onto his back, bringing the cig up. 2 men charged through the ruined doorway. They weren't professionals. They were local tweakers, wired out of their minds, sweating through dirty tank tops. The lead man pumped the action of a sawed-off shotgun. The second man held a rusted 1911 pistol sideways, sweeping the empty room for the mythical cash. Bodert fired twice from the floor. The hollow-point rounds hit the man with the pistol square in the chest. The impact threw him backward through the doorway, his body crashing heavily onto the metal walkway outside. The man with the shotgun pivoted, leveling the sawed-off barrel at Bodert. Cruz fired from a kneeling position behind the kitchen island. The sharp crack of the Glock was painfully loud in the confined space. She fired 3 times in rapid succession. The first round shattered the man's kneecap. The second hit him in the hip. He screamed, dropping the shotgun, and collapsed onto the beige carpet, thrashing in a pool of his own blood. Bodert scrambled to his feet, ignoring the ringing in his ears. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of cordite and pulverized drywall. He moved to the man thrashing on the floor, kicked the shotgun out of reach, and grabbed the back of the man's dirty tank top. He hauled him out of the apartment, dumping him onto the metal walkway next to his dead partner. Move! Bodert shouted at Cruz. They ran out the front door, taking the rusted metal stairs 3 at a time. Doors were flying open all over the courtyard. People were screaming. The absolute chaos of the Lake Worth complex had erupted, triggered perfectly by a ghost who was likely sitting in an air-conditioned coffee shop 3 miles away. They hit the ground floor and sprinted across the cracked concrete toward the Honda Civic. In the distance, the rising wail of police sirens cut through the humid air. The neighbors had finally dialed 911. Bodert slid into the passenger seat. Cruz jumped behind the wheel, jammed the keys into the ignition, and cranked the engine. She threw the Civic into reverse, tires spinning against the asphalt, and backed out of the space with a violent jerk. She slammed the car into drive and tore out of the parking lot just as the first Palm Beach County Sheriff's cruiser turned onto 10th Avenue, its light bar strobing red and blue. Cruz cut the steering wheel hard, diving down a narrow residential side street lined with overgrown banyan trees, putting 2 blocks between them and the approaching sirens. She didn't speak. Her chest was heaving, her knuckles bone-white on the steering wheel. She had just shot a man. She was a suspended detective fleeing an active shooting scene, riding in a car registered to her own name. He set us up, Cruz whispered, her voice shaking with the adrenaline crash. He didn't just burn his identity. He burned us. We can't go to the police now. We can't go to Rivas or anyone else. We're accomplices to a drug shootout. Bodert stared out the window at the blurry, sun-bleached houses flashing past. The ringing in his ears was slowly fading, replaced by the grim reality of their new geometry. Arthur Vance had severed their last tether to the law. They had no institutional cover, no safe house, and no leads. They were completely off the grid. "Drive back to the dirt lot," Bodert said quietly. "We need the truck. And we need to go to war." Chapter 9. Cruz killed the Honda's headlights a quarter-mile before they reached the concrete slab. She navigated the dirt track by memory and moonlight, letting the car roll to a stop in the deep sand beside Bodert's Airstream. She shoved the gear shift into park and killed the engine. The silence of the scrub oak rushed back in, heavy and absolute, a stark contrast to the ringing echoes of the 12-gauge shotgun still vibrating in their skulls. "We need to dump this car," Cruz said, her breathing shallow and fast. Her hands remained gripping the steering wheel. The neighbors in Lake Worth heard the shots. They looked out their windows. Someone saw a silver Civic tearing out of the lot. Bodert didn't answer. He was staring at her left arm. The interior of the car was dark, but the moonlight cutting through the windshield caught a wet, heavy sheen, soaking the fabric of her black t-shirt. It stretched from her shoulder down to her elbow. "You're hit," Bodert said. Cruz looked down at her arm, as if it belonged to someone else. She touched the wet fabric with her right hand. Her fingers came away stained thick and black in the dim light. "It's just a graze," she murmured. The adrenaline was finally beginning to recede, leaving behind the cold, shaking reality of the crash. A stray pellet. Or a piece of the door frame. "I didn't even feel it." "You're going to feel it in about 10 minutes. Bodert opened his door and stepped out into the humid night. "Get out of the car, Elena. Leave the keys in the ignition." She didn't argue. She climbed out, her knees buckling slightly as her boots hit the sand. She caught herself against the roof of the Civic, grinding her teeth as the torn muscle in her shoulder suddenly flared with a hot, sharp ache. Bodert walked over to the rusted Ford F-250. He pulled open the heavy passenger door. "Get in," he ordered. Cruz climbed up onto the cracked vinyl bench seat. Bodert shut the door, rounded the hood, and slid behind the wheel. He fired up the engine. The old V8 roared to life, a loud mechanical comfort in the dark. "Where are we going?" Cruz asked, pressing her right hand hard against her bleeding left arm to apply pressure. "We can't go to an ER. A gunshot wound triggers a mandatory police report. They'll run my name. Miller and Hayes will be standing over my hospital bed before I get stitches." "We aren't going to a hospital," Bodert said. He threw the truck into gear and pulled away from the concrete slab, leaving the silver Civic sitting in the dark. "And we aren't going anywhere near a precinct." He pointed the Ford east, aiming for the intracoastal waterway. He took the back roads, avoiding the well-lit avenues and the highway patrol routes. The drive took 30 minutes. Cruz didn't speak. She rested her head against the cool glass of the passenger window, her eyes squeezed shut, fighting the creeping nausea of blood loss. Bodert turned down a dead-end dirt road lined with dense, tangled mangroves. The headlights swept across a hand-painted wooden sign reading Mangrove Eco Tours. He parked near a stack of overturned kayaks and cut the engine. The air here smelled entirely different from the rest of the county. It was heavy with salt, decaying vegetation, and the sharp tang of the tidal flats. Bodert walked around the truck and helped Cruz down. She was pale, her skin slick with a cold sweat. He kept a steadying hand under her good arm and guided her across the damp wooden planks of the dock toward the main cabin. The building was dark. Bodert didn't bother knocking. He pounded the flat of his hand against the heavy wooden door 3 times. A minute passed. The deadbolt clicked loudly. The door opened. Marta stood in the threshold, wearing a faded gray t-shirt and canvas shorts. Her silver hair was tied back in a messy knot. She held a heavy multi-cell mag light in her right hand, resting it casually on her shoulder like a club. She looked at Bodert, then shifted her gaze to the woman leaning heavily against his side. She took in the blood-soaked shirt, the pale face, and the unmistakable grim geometry of two people running from a bad situation. Marta didn't ask questions. She didn't gasp. She stepped backward and pulled the door wide. "Bring her into the kitchen," Marta said. Bodert guided Cruz into the cabin. The walls were knotty pine, decorated with faded nautical charts and marine life posters. Marta flipped a switch, bathing the commercial kitchen in harsh fluorescent light. "Sit her on the stainless prep table," Marta instructed, already moving toward a heavy wooden cabinet above the sink. Bodert helped Cruz up onto the cold metal counter. Cruz gripped the edge of the table, her jaw locked tight. Marta returned with a large, tackle box-style first aid kit. Living on the water and running tours for tourists meant she was equipped to handle everything from deep fish hook gouges to prop strikes. She popped the latches, pulled out a pair of heavy trauma shears, and stepped up to Cruz. "This is going to ruin the shirt," Marta said. "I have others," Cruz ground out. Marta slid the shears through the collar and cut cleanly down the left sleeve. She peeled the ruined, blood-soaked fabric away from the skin. It wasn't a direct hit. A single, heavy piece of jagged wood from the splintered doorframe had caught Cruz just below the shoulder, tearing a ragged 3-inch trench through the meat of her arm. It was ugly and bleeding freely, but it hadn't hit an artery, and there was no lead buried in the muscle. "It needs cleaning," Marta said, her voice perfectly calm. "It's going to burn." She uncapped a bottle of iodine and poured it generously over a stack of gauze pads. She pressed the soaked gauze directly into the open wound. Cruz let out a sharp, choked hiss. Her back arched off the table, her boots kicking the metal leg of the counter, but she didn't pull away. She stared at the ceiling, her chest heaving. Marta worked quickly and efficiently. She flushed the wound, applied a thick layer of antibiotic ointment, and wrapped the arm tightly in a pressure bandage, securing it with white medical tape. When she was finished, Marta stepped back to wash the blood off her hands in the stainless steel sink. "You're a cop," Marta said over the sound of the running water. Cruz looked up, her breathing slowly returning to normal. "How do you know that?" "You hold yourself like one. Even sitting on a counter, bleeding. You scan the room for exits, and you keep your right hand near your waist where your holster is." Marta dried her hands on a towel. "And you're running with John. Which means you're a cop who ran out of legal options." "I'm suspended." "Then you're a civilian." Marta turned to Bodert. He was leaning against the refrigerator, watching the water outside through the window. "Who is shooting at you, John?" "A ghost," Bodert said. "A guy who strangles working girls and leaves grocery store flowers on the nightstand. We tracked him to his apartment. He wasn't there. He tipped off the local meth dealers that a rival crew was raiding the building and left the door open for us." Marta leaned against the sink, crossing her arms. She looked at Cruz, studying the dark circles under her eyes and the tight and compromising line of her mouth. "Why isn't a suspended detective sitting this out and letting the active badges handle the shootout?" Marta asked quietly. Cruz slid off the metal table. Her boots hit the floor with a heavy thud. She swayed for a fraction of a second, found her balance, and stood perfectly straight. "Because one of the girls he strangled was my sister," Cruz said. Her voice was utterly devoid of self-pity. It was cold, flat, and absolute. And the active badges wrote her off as a bad date. "I'm not sitting it out. I'm going to put him in the ground." Marta held Cruz's stare. The silence in the kitchen stretched, heavy with the weight of the confession. Marta finally looked away. She walked to the commercial coffee machine, grabbed a glass pot, and began filling it with water. "I'll make coffee," Marta said. "You can sleep in the spare room tonight. I don't have tours until Tuesday." Bodert followed Marta into the narrow hallway outside the kitchen, letting the door swing shut behind him. Marta turned on him the second they were out of earshot. The calm, accommodating demeanor vanished. "Are you out of your mind?" Marta hissed, keeping her voice low. "You brought a suspended cop involved in an active shooting to my business. I needed a place to patch her up. We couldn't go to a hospital." "That's not what I'm talking about, John. I patched her up. I don't care about the blood." Marta pointed a rigid finger toward the kitchen door. "Look at her. Look at her eyes. She is completely untethered. She doesn't want justice. She wants an execution. I can manage her. You can't manage her because she's exactly who you used to be." Marta stepped closer, her voice vibrating with an intense, painful history. "She's you 5 years ago, walking around with a badge that didn't matter, looking for an excuse to break the people who broke the rules. You think you're helping her. You're just handing a loaded gun to a woman who is begging for a reason to pull the trigger." Bodert looked down at the scuffed oak floorboards. "Arthur Vance killed 4 women, Marta. He set a trap today that was designed to blow her head off. He isn't going to stop until he gets caught, and he's too smart to get caught by a detective with a clipboard." "So you let her murder him?" "I let her find him. What she does when she's standing in front of him is her choice." "It's not a choice if you walk her right to the edge of the cliff," Marta said bitterly. She shook her head and turned back toward the kitchen. "You sleep on the couch. You leave before the sun comes up. I don't want either of you here when the county sheriffs start knocking on doors asking about a silver Honda." She walked away, leaving Bodert standing in the dark hallway. He knew Marta was right. Cruz was a live wire sparking over a puddle of gasoline. But Arthur Vance was the gasoline, and he was currently flooding the county. Bodert walked back into the kitchen. Cruz was sitting at a small wooden table, staring blankly at the wall. "He burned his apartment," Bodert said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "He burned the shell company. He knows we have his name, which means he knows he can't go back to his day job inspecting foreclosures." Cruz slowly turned her head to look at him. "He doesn't need the day job anymore. He already has the keys. He has a ring of master keys that open hundreds of empty mansions across South Florida. He's a ghost without a haunting ground. He needs a place to sleep tonight." "He'll pick one of the houses," Cruz said, her tactical mind engaging, pushing past the pain in her shoulder. "A property that already passed its final mold inspection. Somewhere the bank won't check for another 6 months. Palm Beach County is massive, Elena. We can't drive up and down every bankrupt subdivision looking for an AC unit running in the dark." Cruz leaned forward, resting her good arm on the table. "We don't have to. Arthur Vance was a meticulous guy. He logged his inspections. If he picked a house to use as a permanent base, he had to scrub it from the active rotation, so another inspector didn't accidentally walk in on him." Bodert nodded slowly, the logic clicking into place. He had to alter the bank's digital schedule. "We need the master log," Cruz said. "We need to see which properties Vance inspected, and specifically flagged as off-market or structurally condemned in the last 48 hours. You lost your badge. I lost my license. Neither of us can subpoena a bank's internal inspection registry." Cruz stared at him, a dark, cynical smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "We don't need a subpoena, John," she whispered. "We just need someone who already has access to the county's digital infrastructure. Someone who owes me a massive favor." Chapter 10. The Florida sun burned off the morning fog, replacing it with a thick, suffocating humidity that made the air feel like warm water. Bodert and Cruz left the silver Honda Civic parked in the deep sand behind Marta's fish camp. The car was burned. If Vance had tipped the Lake Worth police, the plate was already flagged in the county database. They took the rusted Ford F-250 instead, the heavy tires crunching over the crushed shell driveway as they headed back towards civilization. Cruz sat rigidly in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. She wore a clean, oversized gray t-shirt she had borrowed from Marta. Her left arm was bound tightly against her ribs, the thick white medical tape visible just under the sleeve. She hadn't complained about the pain once, but a fine layer of sweat coated her forehead and her breathing was shallow. "Where's the meet?" Bodert asked. "Downtown West Palm. A parking garage off Clematis Street," Cruz said. She checked her phone, navigating an encrypted messaging app. Level 4. Away from the security cameras. "Who is he?" "His name is Leo. He's a systems administrator for the county property appraiser's office. He manages the servers that handle the municipal inspection logs, the zoning changes, and the bank authorizations." "And why is he risking a state pension for a suspended cop?" "Because 2 years ago, Leo's 19-year-old kid brother got pulled over with a brick of black tar heroin in his trunk," Cruz said, her voice entirely flat. "I was the responding detective. The kid was terrified. He was just a mule, moving weight for a local crew, because he owed a gambling debt. I didn't book him. I seized the brick, dumped it in a storm drain, and told the kid to leave the state." Bodert looked over at her. "You destroyed a felony quantity of narcotics." "I saved a kid's life," Cruz corrected. "And Leo knows it. He owes me a life. I'm calling it in." Bodert didn't judge the math. It was exactly the kind of leverage that actually made the world turn, operating completely beneath the sterile surface of the law. They reached downtown West Palm Beach 40 minutes later. The morning commuter traffic was heavy, a gridlock of luxury sedans and municipal buses. Bodert navigated the rusted Ford into the concrete parking structure, the exhaust echoing loudly as they spiraled up the ramps. Level 4 was nearly empty. A solitary white Toyota Camry sat parked in the far corner, backed into a space facing the ramp. Bodert parked the Ford 3 spaces away. He left the engine idling. "I'll go," Cruz said, reaching for the door handle. "I'll cover you." Bodert rested his hand on the Sig Sauer in his shoulder holster, watching the driver's side window of the Camry. Cruz stepped out. She walked across the oily concrete, her posture projecting absolute, intimidating authority despite the bandage on her arm. The driver's door of the Camry opened. A man in his late 40s stepped out, wearing a rumpled button-down shirt and a nervous, sweating expression. He clutched a standard manila folder to his chest. They didn't shake hands. Leo spoke rapidly, his eyes darting toward the security cameras mounted near the elevators, terrified of the digital footprint he was leaving. Cruz just listened, her face an unreadable mask. 10 seconds later, Leo shoved the folder into her hand, climbed back into his Camry, and started the engine. He didn't wait for Cruz to walk away. He threw the car into drive and sped toward the down ramp, the tires squealing against the painted concrete. Cruz walked back to the truck and climbed in. She dropped the folder onto the bench seat between them. "He filtered the master log," Cruz said, slightly out of breath. "Searched for Inspector ID AV 884. Arthur Vance." Then he cross-referenced Vance's completed inspections against properties flagged as structurally condemned or chemically hazardous in the last 48 hours. Bodert put the Ford in gear and headed down the ramp. A hazardous flag keeps the real estate agents out. And it keeps the bank from sending secondary auditors. Cruz flipped the folder open. It contained a single, printed spreadsheet. Vance flagged 3 properties yesterday morning, right after he murdered Tanya, and realized we were tracking him. She ran her finger down the column of addresses. "The first one is the model home in Cypress Hollow. The one we hit last night. Cross it off, Bodert said, pulling out of the parking garage and merging into the heavy traffic on Banyan Boulevard. The county deputies already kicked the doors in. He can't go back there. That leaves two, Cruz said. She stared at the paper. One is a foreclosed equestrian estate in Jupiter Farms. 10 acres, fully fenced. The other is a half-finished mansion out on the edge of the Loxahatchee Slough. Nothing but swamp and alligators on 3 sides. Both isolated. Both wired for power. Bodert evaluated the geography. Jupiter Farms is closer. We hit that one first. If it's empty, we drive west to the slough. We're going in light, Cruz noted, tapping her hip. She only had the 15 rounds in her Glock. Bodert had his SIG and a single spare magazine. Vance isn't hiring tweakers with shotguns anymore. He's backed into a corner. If he's sitting in one of those houses, he's going to be armed and waiting. I have a Remington 870 pump-action bolted to the floorboards under the bed in the Airstream, Bodert said. And a lockbox with extra magazines. We swing by the lot, gear up, and we take the war to him. He pointed the heavy grill of the Ford south, aiming for the dirt tracks that bordered the intracoastal. The drive took 20 minutes. The closer they got to his lot, the quieter the world became. The coastal wealth vanished, replaced by the dense, suffocating canopy of scrub oak and the blinding glare of the sun reflecting off the white sand. Bodert turned off the cracked asphalt onto his private dirt road. He immediately smelled it. It wasn't the smell of salt water, and it wasn't the scent of rotting mangroves. It was the sharp, highly toxic stench of burning petroleum, melting plastic, and scorching aluminum. Bodert slammed his boot down on the accelerator. The Ford tore down the dirt track, the suspension violently bottoming out in the deep ruts, kicking up a massive cloud of pale dust. They cleared the tree line. The Airstream was an inferno. Thick, oily black smoke poured into the blue sky, visible for miles. The intense heat of the fire had already warped the iconic silver skin of the trailer, the aluminum peeling back like a roasted blister to expose the burning insulation and wooden framing underneath. The bucket of marine sealant Bodert had been using to patch the roof the day before was acting as an accelerant, sending thick sheets of liquid fire rolling down the curved sides. Bodert slammed the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt at the edge of the concrete slab, the heat from the blaze instantly washing over the windshield. He threw the door open and stepped out. The roar of the fire was deafening. It sounded like a jet engine running at full throttle. The heat pushed him backward, a physical wall that instantly singed the hair on his forearms. Cruz stepped out of the passenger side, staring at the destruction. John. Bodert didn't say a word. He stood on the edge of the slab, watching his life turn to ash. The fold-down table was gone. The framed county zoning violation was gone. The weather radio that had kept him company through a dozen tropical storms was a puddle of melted plastic on the linoleum floor. The Remington shotgun and the spare ammunition bolted under the bed were completely inaccessible, swallowed by a wall of orange flame. Arthur Vance hadn't just run. He had actively hunted them down. He had driven out to the absolute middle of nowhere, found the only physical address connected to John Bohannon, and systematically erased it from the map. It was a perfectly executed, psychological strike. Vance was trying to prove that the ghost could reach out and touch them whenever he wanted. A loud, sharp pop echoed from the center of the blaze as a sealed aerosol can exploded in the kitchenette. A shower of sparks rained down on the hot concrete. Bodert slowly reached up and wiped a streak of soot off his cheek. He didn't yell. He didn't kick the dirt. The professional detachment he had maintained since Elena Cruz walked onto his lot completely evaporated. The fire burned away the investigator, leaving behind nothing but the violent, unstoppable momentum of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Marta had warned him about the wrecking ball. She had warned him not to let Cruz pull the trigger. But Arthur Vance had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. He hadn't broken Bodert's spirit. He had just removed the only leash holding the dog back. Bodert turned around and walked back to the Ford. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying granite. He climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the heavy door shut. Cruz slid in beside him. She looked at his face and instinctively pulled her hand away from the dashboard. She recognized the look. It was the exact same look she saw in the mirror every time she thought about Sophia. "The shotgun is gone," Cruz said quietly over the roar of the fire. "I don't need the shotgun," Bodert said. He threw the truck into reverse, backing roughly away from the burning slab. "He thinks he took my teeth. He's wrong." He dropped the transmission into drive. The Ford tore out of the lot, leaving the burning Airstream behind, the black smoke rising like a massive dark flag in the rearview mirror. "Which address is closest?" Bodert asked, his voice a low mechanical rasp. Cruz looked down at the master log resting on the bench seat. "Jupiter Farms." "Then we go to Jupiter Farms," Bodert said, pressing the accelerator to the floorboard. "And we burn his house down." Chapter 11. The cab of the Ford F-250 smelled like melted plastic and ash. The odor clung to Bodert's skin and permeated the canvas of his jacket, a bitter, chemical reminder of the concrete slab they had left burning in the rearview mirror. He drove north on the turnpike, keeping the speedometer pinned at 85. The heavy mud tires hummed a violent, vibrating rhythm against the hot asphalt. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't speak. Elena Cruz sat slumped against the passenger door, her right hand resting lightly on the white medical tape binding her left arm. The adrenaline from the Lake Worth shootout was long gone, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache that radiated from her shoulder down to her fingertips. "Take the Indiantown Road exit," Cruz said, her voice tight. "Head west into the farms." Jupiter Farms wasn't a neighborhood. It was a sprawling, unincorporated grid of dirt roads, deep pine woods, and 5-acre lots where people moved when they wanted to be left completely alone. There were no streetlights, no sidewalks, and no municipal water lines. Just deep drainage swales and aggressively enforced property lines. Bodert took the exit entirely too fast. The heavy truck leaned hard on its suspension, the tires squealing as he merged onto the 2-lane blacktop heading west. The coastal development rapidly fell away, swallowed by dense stands of slash pine and overgrown palmetto scrub. "Give me the address," Bodert said. 14800 Sandy Run, Cruz read from the master log on her lap. "It's a 10-acre equestrian foreclosure. The bank evicted the breeder 2 years ago." Bodert navigated the maze of dirt roads, the Ford kicking up a massive wake of pale, choking dust. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, baking the heavy canopy overhead. They found Sandy Run at the dead end of a heavily rutted washboard road. The property was hidden behind a towering wall of untrimmed ficus trees. The entrance was blocked by a heavy, wrought iron gate set between 2 crumbling brick columns. A heavy-duty chain and a thick brass padlock secured the center bars. Bodert didn't stop the truck. He didn't reach for his tension wrenches. He shifted the transmission into low gear. "Brace yourself," Bodert said. Cruz threw her right hand against the dashboard. Bodert pressed the accelerator to the floor. The rusted Ford roared, launching forward. The heavy steel of the caved-in front grille slammed directly into the center of the wrought iron gate. The impact was deafening. The rusted chain snapped instantly, the heavy links flying into the weeds like shrapnel. The iron gates blew open, shrieking on their hinges, bending inward under the sheer, unstoppable mass of the truck. Bodert drove right over the crumpled metal, the undercarriage scraping violently, and barreled up the crushed shell driveway. He slammed the brakes in front of a massive, two-story Mediterranean-style house. The clay tile roof was missing patches, and the sweeping front lawn was waist-high with dead grass, but the windows were fully intact. Bodert killed the engine. He drew the Sig Sauer, kicked his door open, and stepped out into the crushing heat. "Move," Bodert ordered. Cruz climbed out, her face pale, the Glock drawn and steady in her right hand despite the pain in her left. They didn't bother checking the lockbox on the front door. Bodert raised his heavy boot and drove it directly into the space next to the deadbolt. The wood splintered with a sharp crack. The door flew open, crashing heavily against the interior drywall. They flooded the threshold. The air conditioning was running full blast, chilling the stagnant air inside the massive foyer. The house was completely unfurnished. Their boots echoed loudly off the bare marble floors as they moved through the cavernous living room, clearing the corners with fluid, lethal precision. The kitchen was empty. The formal dining room was empty. Bodert led the way up the sweeping central staircase. The second floor was a long hallway lined with closed doors. They cleared the guest rooms one by one. Nothing but dust, bare carpet, and the faint smell of industrial bleach. They reached the double doors of the master suite at the end of the hall. Bodert kicked the right door open. The master bedroom wasn't empty. It was heavily, meticulously occupied. It didn't look like a serial killer's lair. It looked like a high-end, corporate staging area. A folding plastic table sat in the center of the room. On it rested a high-powered laptop, a laser printer, and a stack of manila folders perfectly aligned with the edge of the plastic. A rolling garment rack stood near the walk-in closet, holding 5 identical freshly pressed gray polo shirts and 5 pairs of dark slacks. Arthur Vance wasn't a chaotic monster. He was a man who went to work. Bodert lowered the Sig and walked over to the folding table. Sitting right next to the laptop was a large black Pelican tactical case. It was heavy-duty, secured with 2 steel latches. Bodert flipped the latches and threw the lid open. Resting in a bed of custom-cut foam was a Benelli M4 tactical shotgun. The weapon was pristine, oiled, and completely unmarred. Beside it lay 4 boxes of heavy 12-gauge buckshot and a sleek black Glock 19 with 3 extended magazines. Vance didn't just use zip ties and bleach. He was heavily armed for the day someone finally came looking for him. Bodert picked up the Benelli. He checked the action. It was smooth, cold, and entirely lethal. He picked up a handful of red shotgun shells and began thumbing them into the tubular magazine, the satisfying mechanical clack echoing in the quiet room. "If he burns my shotgun," Bodert said, his voice flat and dead, "I take his." Cruz wasn't looking at the weapons. She was standing over the laser printer. Sitting in the output tray was a single, freshly printed sheet of paper. It wasn't an inspection log or a bank authorization form. It was a digital receipt from a local grocery store, time-stamped exactly 45 minutes ago. Cruz picked it up. Her hand trembled slightly. "John," she whispered. Bodert racked the pump of the Benelli, chambering around, and walked over to her. He looked down at the receipt in her hand. The purchase consisted of 2 items, a 12-pack of generic bottled water and 1 bouquet of pink carnations. "He's not here," Cruz said, her voice tight, fighting the rising panic. "He was here this morning. He printed the receipt from his digital wallet. But he left 45 minutes ago. He has the flowers. He's setting the table." Bodert looked out the large master bedroom window. The sun was beginning its slow arc toward the western horizon. The sky over the Everglades was turning a harsh, blinding white. "Loxahatchee," Bodert said. "The slough," Cruz confirmed, dropping the receipt onto the plastic table. "The half-finished mansion. It's the only property left on the master log he hasn't burned. He took a girl there this morning. He's prepping the scene right now. Bodert reached into the Pelican case, grabbed the loaded Glock 19 and the spare magazines, and shoved them toward Cruz. "Take it," Bodert ordered. "Your 15 rounds aren't going to be enough when we corner him." Cruz holstered her own weapon and took the Glock, checking the chamber with a sharp, practiced pull of the slide. She shoved the extended magazines into her back pocket. Bodert turned and walked out of the master suite, the heavy Benelli gripped in his right hand. They moved fast, taking the stairs 2 at a time, leaving the sterile, organized staging area behind. They burst through the shattered front doors and out into the blistering heat of the Jupiter Farms afternoon. Bodert climbed into the Ford, tossing the Benelli onto the bench seat between them. He threw the truck into reverse, backed over the mangled wrought iron gate one last time, and slammed the transmission into drive. He pointed the heavy grill west, toward the deep sinking swamps of the Loxahatchee Slough. Arthur Vance had a 45-minute head start. The table was being set, the flowers were in the water, and the wrecking ball was coming straight for the dining room. Chapter 12. The Loxahatchee Slough did not welcome visitors. It was a dense, primordial stretch of protected wetlands that actively resisted human engineering. Developers had spent decades trying to drain the margins, pouring millions of dollars into limestone fill and drainage canals, only to watch the swamp swallow their investments the second the economy dipped. Bodert turned the Ford off Seminole Pratt Whitney Road, leaving the cracked asphalt for a washboard track of crushed white shell. The sun was dropping fast, burning a violent blood-orange hole in the western horizon. The deep shadows of the cypress trees stretched across the road, turning the shallow water standing in the drainage ditches the color of dark tea. The heat hadn't broken. It hung in the still air, thick and suffocating, breeding clouds of gnats that plastered themselves against the truck's windshield. Elena Cruz sat in the passenger seat, the stolen Glock 19 resting flat on her thigh. She pressed the magazine release, caught the extended clip in her palm, verified the top brass round, and drove it back into the magwell with a sharp, professional slap. Bodert kept his eyes on the narrow road. The Benelli M4 tactical shotgun sat propped against the bench seat between his thigh and the transmission tunnel. "We can't drive right up to the front door," Bodert said. "The muffler is rusted through. He'll hear the exhaust a mile away." "He knows we're coming," Cruz replied, her eyes locked on the darkening tree line. "He printed the receipt. He left his staging area. He's expecting an audience." Expecting us and hearing us pull into the driveway are two different things. We give up the noise, we give up the only tactical advantage we have left. Bodert eased his foot off the accelerator. 2 miles down the Shell Rock Road, the track dead ended at a massive berm of dredged limestone. Beyond the berm, a private unpaved driveway carved its way through a dense, suffocating canopy of slash pine and cabbage palms. Bodert cut the engine. The Ford rattled, pinged, and died. The sudden silence was instantly replaced by the deafening, electric thrum of the slough. Millions of cicadas screaming in the brush. The deep, guttural bellow of a bull gator somewhere in the black water to the south. Bodert grabbed the Benelli. He checked the safety with his thumb and opened his door, stepping out into mud that immediately sucked at the soles of his boots. Cruz climbed out of the passenger side. The sudden exertion pulled at the torn muscle in her left arm. She winced, her breath catching sharply, but she quickly squared her shoulders and raised the Glock. "How far?" she whispered over the drone of the insects. "A mile," Bodert estimated, looking at the tire tracks cut deep into the mud leading around the limestone berm. "Keep your eyes on the ground. Water moccasins hunt at dusk." They moved out, leaving the rusted truck behind. The hike was brutal. The air was entirely stagnant beneath the canopy. Within 10 minutes, Bodert's canvas jacket was plastered to his back. Sweat stung his eyes. Cruz walked slightly behind his right shoulder, her boots sinking into the saturated earth, fighting a silent war against the creeping lethargy of blood loss. She moved with her weapon at the low ready, her head constantly swiveling, clearing the dense brush on both sides of the narrow track. The trees finally began to thin out, giving way to a massive, circular clearing carved directly out of the swamp. Bodert dropped to a knee, raising a clenched fist. Cruz immediately crouched behind him, using his broad shoulders for cover. 50 yards across the clearing stood the half-finished mansion. It was a staggering monument to bad credit and unchecked ambition. 3 stories of gray cinderblock and unpainted stucco rose out of the sawgrass. The roof was covered in black tar paper, waiting for clay tiles that had never been delivered. But the heavy, impact-resistant windows were installed, and the massive mahogany front double doors were hung perfectly in their frames. It wasn't an abandoned ruin. It was a functional, watertight fortress sitting in the middle of nowhere. "Look at the master meter," Cruz whispered, pointing the muzzle of her Glock toward the side of the house. A heavy, gray, electrical box was mounted to the raw cinder block. A thick, black temporary power line snaked from the box across the muddy yard, disappearing into the tree line toward a municipal pole on the main road. The green digital display on the meter was glowing bright in the fading light. "The bank kept the grid active," Bodert said softly. "And Vance logged the inspections to make sure they never shut it down." Bodert scanned the perimeter. The front yard was a chaotic mess of construction debris, pallets of unused bricks, rusted wheelbarrows, and stacks of rotting drywall. But there was no vehicle parked on the circular dirt driveway. He walked in with a 12-pack of water and a bouquet of flowers, Bodert said. He didn't hike a mile in this mud carrying supplies. He drove. Bodert shifted his gaze, tracking the deep tire ruts running parallel to the driveway. The tracks veered sharply to the left, heading toward a dense, overgrown cluster of ancient banyan trees sitting 50 feet from the house. Bodert tapped Cruz's shoulder and pointed. They moved off the dirt track, sinking into the knee-high sawgrass, circling wide to keep the massive banyan trees between them and the windows of the house. The shadows were lengthening rapidly, turning the clearing a deep, bruised purple. They reached the edge of the trees. Parked deep in the root system, completely obscured from the driveway and the main road, was a white, late-model Ford F-150. Bodert moved silently to the front quarter panel. The truck was impeccably clean. A municipal seal was printed on the driver's side door in faded blue ink, Palm Beach County Property Appraiser, Inspection Division. Bodert placed his bare hand flat against the metal hood. It was radiating heat. The engine block was still ticking faintly, settling after a hard drive. "He's here," Bodert breathed. Cruz moved to the cab of the truck, keeping her profile low. She peered through the passenger window. The interior was spotless. A yellow reflective safety vest hung over the driver's seat. A hard hat sat on the dashboard. It was the perfect urban camouflage. A truck that could park outside any gated community, any foreclosed property, or any elementary school in the state without drawing a single second glance. "We don't go through the front door," Cruz said, her voice a tight, focused whisper. "It's a fatal funnel. He knows we tracked his staging area. He expects us to breach the main entrance." Bodert nodded, looking up at the sprawling, unpainted structure. Model homes and mansions usually have secondary service entrances for the catering staff and pool cleaners. Back corner. They left the white county truck in the shadows and moved toward the rear of the property. The backyard was a massive, excavated crater where a custom swimming pool had been dug but never poured. Stagnant rainwater and thick green algae filled the deep hole. They hugged the raw cinderblock wall, keeping underneath the sight lines of the first-floor windows. They reached the back patio. The sliding glass doors were locked, but tucked into a recessed alcove near the uninstalled outdoor kitchen was a heavy steel utility door. Bodert checked the handle. Locked tight. He didn't have his tension wrenches, and kicking a solid steel door set in cinder block would only break his ankle. But Vance hadn't bothered to upgrade the builder-grade hardware on the service entrance. Bodert raised the Benelli M4. He pressed the aggressive, toothed muzzle of the tactical shotgun directly against the cheap brass deadbolt, angling the barrel downward to catch the internal mechanism. He looked at Cruz. She clamped a hand over her left ear and opened her mouth to equalize the pressure. Bodert pulled the trigger. The 12-gauge buckshot obliterated the lock. The deafening roar of the gunshot rolled across the slough, instantly silencing the cicadas and the frogs. The brass housing disintegrated in a shower of sparks and shredded metal. Bodert kicked the door hard. It swung inward, crashing against an unpainted drywall corridor. He pumped the action of the Benelli, ejecting the smoking red plastic shell onto the patio, and stepped into the dark. The wrecking ball had officially arrived. Chapter 13. The drywall corridor swallowed the echo of the shotgun blast, leaving a thick, suffocating ringing in Bodert's ears. He pumped the Benelli, chambering a fresh shell, and stepped over the smoking ruin of the steel utility door. Cruz moved in right on his shoulder, her Glock raised, the beam of her tactical flashlight slicing through the pitch-black hallway. The air inside the half-finished mansion was dead and heavy. It smelled of raw pine studs, curing concrete, and the lingering sulfuric bite of cordite. A fine layer of white gypsum dust coated the floor, disturbed only by the heavy deliberate tracks of Arthur Vance's work boots leading deeper into the house. Bodert killed his own flashlight. In a gunfight, a beam of light was just a glowing target painted on your chest. He moved by the ambient spill of Cruz's light, navigating a labyrinth of exposed ductwork and stacked 2x4s. "Watch your feet," Bodert whispered. "Construction sites are full of tripwires. Plywood covering elevator shafts, loose rebar." Cruz didn't answer. Her breathing was ragged, fighting the steady, creeping drain of the torn muscle in her arm, but her weapon remained perfectly steady. They cleared the corridor and stepped out into what would eventually be the grand living room. The space was cavernous, spanning 2 full stories up to a vaulted ceiling webbed with exposed wooden trusses. A wide, sweeping concrete staircase curved up to a second-floor gallery that wrapped around 3 sides of the room. Thick sheets of translucent plastic hung from the scaffolding, dividing the massive space into pale ghostly squares. It was completely silent. Bodert raised the Benelli, tracking the dark gallery above. If Vance was waiting, he had the high ground. He had the fatal angles. A sharp, heavy mechanical clack echoed from a utility closet somewhere in the dark. The sound of a massive industrial breaker being thrown. Instantly, a bank of 4 10,000-lumen halogen job site lights flared to life. The blinding, white-hot glare hit Bodert like a physical strike. It washed out the entire first floor, erasing the shadows and turning the plastic sheeting into glowing, impenetrable walls of white light. Cruz flinched, instinctively bringing a hand up to shield her eyes, her tactical flashlight rendered completely useless. Then the music started. It wasn't a siren or a construction alarm. It was a vintage, syrupy doo-wop ballad from the 1950s, blaring at a deafening, concert-level volume through a pair of heavy Bluetooth industrial speakers mounted to the scaffolding. The slow, romantic crooning echoed violently off the raw concrete block, turning the cavernous living room into a twisted, chaotic funhouse. Vance was trying to blind them. He was trying to deafen them. Bodert squinted through the searing halogen glare, sweeping the barrel of the Benelli across the room. Sitting dead center on the concrete subfloor, directly beneath the blinding lights, was a metal folding chair. A young woman was tied to it. Heavy plastic zip ties secured her wrists to the metal armrests and her ankles to the legs. She was in her early 20s, her dark hair a tangled mess. A wide strip of silver duct tape covered her mouth. She was thrashing wildly against the plastic restraints, her eyes wide with absolute, suffocating terror. But it was what she was wearing that made Cruz let out a sharp, horrified gasp over the blaring music. Vance hadn't left her in her own clothes. He had dressed her in a crisp, conservative, knee-length floral sundress. Over the dress, he had tied a pristine white cooking apron. The grotesque, mid-century domestic fantasy was perfectly curated, staged under 10,000 lumens of industrial lighting. "Cover the gallery," Bodert shouted, though he could barely hear his own voice over the booming doo-wop track. He broke from the wall, sprinting low across the exposed concrete toward the center of the room. He reached the girl, dropping to one knee beside the chair, keeping his body positioned between her and the sweeping staircase. She screamed behind the duct tape, flinching away from the shotgun. "I'm getting you out," Bodert yelled, pulling the folding knife from his pocket. He snapped the blade open and slid the steel under the thick plastic zip tie biting into her right wrist. High above them, a shadow shifted behind the plastic sheeting on the second-floor gallery. Vance didn't use a shotgun. He used a suppressed 9mm pistol. PFF'd. 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 The muzzle flashes were faint, hidden behind the glare of the halogens, but the impacts were devastating. A 9mm slug shattered the concrete floor 3 inches from Bodert's knee, throwing a razor-sharp cloud of rock dust into his face. The second round tore through the plastic back of the folding chair, missing the girl's spine by a fraction of an inch. Bodert grabbed the girl by the collar of her floral dress and hauled her violently out of the chair, throwing her flat onto the concrete. "Upstairs. Left side," Bodert roared. He didn't wait for Cruz to acquire the target. Bodert raised the Benelli, aimed at the plastic sheeting where the muzzle flashes had sparked, and pulled the trigger. The 12-gauge buckshot absolutely shredded the second floor. The blast tore through the plastic, splintered the raw wooden railing, and decimated a stack of drywall leaning against the wall behind it. A thick cloud of white gypsum dust exploded into the air, completely obscuring the gallery. Cruz fired twice from the shadows, her Glock barking sharply, the 9mm rounds punching tight holes through the scaffolding where Vance had been standing. For 2 seconds, the only sound was the booming, cheerful 1950s love song echoing through the dust. Then, the heavy mechanical breaker clacked again. The halogen lights instantly died. The mansion was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. Bodert's eyes, fully dilated to handle the 10,000 lumens, were completely blind. He pressed himself flat against the cold concrete, next to the terrified girl, sweeping the Benelli blindly through the dark, waiting for the muzzle flashes to return. "Elena," Bodert shouted over the blaring music. "I'm moving," Cruz yelled back. Her voice came from the far right, near the corridor leading to the east wing of the house. The music suddenly cut off. The silence that followed was heavy and ringing. Bodert lay perfectly still, holding his breath, listening for the crunch of drywall dust under heavy work boots. Vance was up there. He had night vision. He knew the layout of the mansion perfectly, and he had just successfully blinded the only 2 people trying to kill him. PFF'd. PFF'd. 2 more suppressed rounds slammed into the floorboards near the east wing corridor. Cruz returned fire instantly, the bright strobe-like flash of her Glock illuminating the raw wooden studs of the hallway for a fraction of a second. She was pinned down, trapped in the narrow choke point of the corridor by plunging fire from the dark gallery above. "He's moving right," Cruz shouted, her voice tight with pain. "He has an angle on the hallway." "Stay down," Bodert ordered. He grabbed the girl's arm, pulling her close. He reached up and ripped the duct tape off her mouth in one sharp, brutal pull. She gasped, sucking in the dust-choked air, a sob breaking in her throat. "Can you walk?" Bodert whispered harshly in her ear. "Yes," she choked out. I'm going to lay down, covering fire. You crawl toward the door we came in through. Don't stand up. Don't look back. You hit the mud, and you run into the trees. Understand?" She nodded against his shoulder in the dark. Bodert rolled onto his back. He pointed the Benelli at the ceiling above the east corridor, roughly tracking where Vance's suppressed rounds had originated. He didn't have a target, but he had a wide spread and heavy lead. He pulled the trigger 3 times in rapid succession. The concussive roar of the shotgun inside the concrete box was paralyzing. The ceiling above the hallway rained splintered wood and shredded insulation. The strobe of the muzzle flashes painted the massive room in stark strobing bursts of white light. Bodert felt the girl scramble away from him in the dark, crawling desperately toward the back patio on her hands and knees. He pumped the final spent shell from the Benelli and scrambled to his feet, pulling a handful of fresh rounds from his pocket to reload on the move. He sprinted toward the east wing to back up Cruz. A heavy, metallic groan echoed from the second floor. Vance hadn't just been shooting. He had been working. A massive, heavy-duty industrial drywall cart, loaded with 2,000 pounds of stacked sheetrock, rolled over the edge of the second-floor gallery. Vance had pushed it directly off the balcony above the east wing entrance. Bodert looked up just as a ton of plaster and steel crashed down from the ceiling. "Cruz!" Bodert roared. The cart hit the concrete floor squarely in the center of the east corridor archway. The impact was catastrophic. The steel frame crumpled. The massive stacks of drywall shattered, exploding outward in a blinding, suffocating tidal wave of white dust and jagged debris. Bodert threw his arms up, turning away as the shockwave of the impact blasted over him. Pieces of shattered gypsum pelted his canvas jacket like shrapnel. He coughed violently, choking on the thick alkaline dust filling the air, and aimed his flashlight at the corridor. The archway was completely blocked. A mountain of shattered drywall and twisted steel filled the space from floor to ceiling. Elena Cruz was trapped on the other side. Bodert stepped forward, racking the Benelli, his eyes scanning the dark gallery above. "Elena," he yelled, his voice tearing through the dust. There was no answer from the other side of the rubble. Just the sound of Arthur Vance's heavy work boots moving slowly, deliberately across the plywood subfloor on the second level, heading toward the east wing stairs to finish the job. Chapter 14. Bodert threw his shoulder against the twisted steel framing of the collapsed drywall cart. The jagged metal didn't budge an inch. 2,000 pounds of shattered gypsum board was wedged perfectly into the archway, forming a solid, impenetrable plug between the main living room and the east corridor. He coughed, spitting a thick wad of alkaline dust onto the concrete floor. "Elena!" Bodert shouted, pressing his face close to a small gap in the rubble. "I'm here," her voice drifted back. It was faint, muffled by the dense wall of plaster, but steady. "I'm not pinned. Can you clear a path?" "No. It's jammed floor to ceiling." Above them, the slow, heavy tread of Arthur Vance's work boots echoed through the exposed floor joists. The footsteps moved deliberately away from the collapsed balcony, heading toward the rear of the house. "He's taking the secondary stairs down to your side," Bodert warned, his voice a harsh rasp. "He has night vision. You are completely exposed." "I know. I'm going out the back patio. I'll breach the exterior windows of the east wing from the yard. Keep moving away from the staircase. Do not engage him in the dark." Bodert didn't wait for her confirmation. He spun away from the blocked archway, racking the Benelli M4, and sprinted blindly across the pitch-black living room toward the shattered utility door they had used to enter. On the other side of the rubble, Elena Cruz knelt in the dark. The silence pressing in on her was absolute. She closed her eyes, letting her pupils dilate, trying to pull any ambient light from the heavy shadows. It was useless. The thick hurricane windows of the mansion blocked the moonlight. The darkness was a physical weight. Her left arm was screaming. The violent dive, to avoid the plunging crossfire, had torn the half-clotted graze wide open. Warm blood soaked through Marta's white medical tape, running in a steady, terrifying tickle down her forearm to pool inside the palm of her hand. She ignored it. She wiped her bloody palm on her jeans and tightened her two-handed grip on the Glock 19. She opened her eyes and looked up. The east wing wasn't finished. There was no dry wall on the interior framing. It was just a sprawling skeletal maze of vertical pine studs spaced 16 inches apart. Which meant she had absolutely no cover. If Vance walked down the rear stairs with a pair of light-amplifying goggles strapped to his face, he could look straight through the skeletal walls of 5 different rooms and see her crouching in the corridor. A wooden stair tread groaned faintly at the far end of the wing. Cruz moved. She stayed low, sliding across the plywood subfloor, letting her right shoulder brush lightly against the exposed pine framing to guide her in the pitch black. She navigated through what was framed to be a massive master bathroom, her boots stepping carefully over raw PVC plumbing pipes sticking up from the concrete. She needed a choke point. She needed to blind him. Modern night vision goggles amplified ambient light by a factor of thousands. They turned a pitch-black room into a crisp, glowing green landscape. But the technology had a massive vulnerability. A sudden, overwhelming burst of white light would overload the phosphor tubes, blinding the wearer instantly. Cruz pulled the tactical flashlight from her belt. She didn't click it on. If she held the light, she became the target. The suppressed 9mm round would hit her chest a fraction of a second after she pushed the button. She backed into the furthest corner of the framed-out bathroom, wedging herself between a concrete block exterior wall and a thick stack of unused plywood. She was trapped, but she had a clean, unobstructed funnel looking back through the pine studs toward the hallway. The soft, deliberate crunch of a heavy boot stepping on scattered drywall dust echoed through the quiet house. Vance was on the first floor. Cruz held her breath. The pain in her shoulders spiked, a hot, nauseating wave that threatened to drag her under. She bit down hard on the inside of her cheek, using the sharp copper taste of her own blood to anchor her focus. 30 feet away, a shadow detached itself from the absolute blackness of the corridor. Vance moved with terrifying, unhurried precision. He didn't bump into the exposed framing. He didn't trip over the construction debris. He was navigating his own private hunting ground, his face obscured behind a bulky twin-tube night vision optic mounted to a tactical skull-crusher harness. He held the suppressed 9mm pistol extended, sweeping the skeletal rooms left and right. He stopped. He was looking directly through the pine studs at the corner where Cruz knelt. He couldn't see the details of her face, but the ambient starlight filtering through the dirty exterior windows was more than enough for the goggles to paint her silhouette against the plywood stack. Vance raised the pistol. Cruz didn't hesitate. She threw the heavy aluminum flashlight as hard as she could, aiming low, skipping it across the plywood subfloor toward the center of the room. The moment it left her hand, she dove to her right. PFF'd. PFF'd. 2 suppressed rounds slammed into the concrete block wall exactly where her head had been a half-second earlier, showering her neck with powdered mortar. The flashlight hit the floorboards, rolled twice, and Cruz hit the remote pressure switch clutched in her left hand. The flashlight didn't just turn on. It erupted into a blinding, high-frequency tactical strobe. 10,000 lumens of white light pulsed at 20 flashes per second, exploding through the dark room. The violent strobing glare reflected off the raw pine studs, turning the entire east wing into a chaotic flashing nightmare. Vance screamed. The sudden, catastrophic overload of light blasted directly into his amplified optic tubes. The safety auto-gating mechanism kicked in to shut the goggles down, but it was a fraction of a second too late. His retinas were seared. He stumbled backward, ripping one hand off his pistol to claw frantically at the harness on his head, trying to tear the useless, blinded goggles away from his eyes. Cruz fired from the floor. The Glock 19 barked, the muzzle flash momentarily freezing the chaotic room. She fired 3 times, aiming at the center of the strobing, flailing mass in the hallway. One of the 9mm hollow points caught Vance in the left thigh. He grunted heavily, his leg buckling under his weight. He crashed into the raw pine framing, splintering a 2x4. But he didn't drop his weapon. Firing blind through the strobing light, Vance squeezed the trigger of the suppressed 9mm in a rapid, sweeping arc. Bullets chewed through the pine studs all around Cruz. Wood splinters rained down on her. A piece of jagged, shattered framing whipped across her cheek, laying the skin open. Cruz flattened herself against the cold concrete floor, covering her head as the barrage tore the unfinished bathroom apart. Outside, a heavy, rhythmic pounding echoed against the exterior wall. Bodert had made it around to the east wing. He was standing in the flooded, muddy crater of the undug swimming pool, swinging the steel stock of the Benelli M4 like a sledgehammer against the first-floor bedroom window. Crash. Crash. The impact-resistant hurricane glass spider webbed, but it refused to shatter. The thick, laminated polycarbonate inner layer absorbed the brutal impacts, holding the fractured glass suspended in the frame like a massive, opaque spiderweb. "Break!" Bodert roared, his voice muffled by the heavy glass. He stepped back in the mud, leveled the Benelli at the center of the window, and pulled the trigger. The 12-gauge slug blew a hole the size of a grapefruit through the laminated glass, destroying the structural integrity of the pane. Inside the house, the tactical flashlight finally died, its battery contact jarred loose by the vibrations of the gunfire. The east wing was plunged instantly back into total darkness. Cruz lay on the floor, her ears ringing from the close-quarters exchange, her face bleeding. She listened intently. The heavy, dragging sound of a man trying to walk on a shattered thigh echoed down the hallway. Vance wasn't pushing the attack. Stripped of his night vision advantage and bleeding badly, the ghost was retreating toward the rear of the mansion. "Elena!" Bodert shouted, his arm reaching through the jagged hole in the hurricane glass to find the internal latch. "He's hit!" Cruz yelled back, forcing herself up onto one knee. The room spun wildly for a second before stabilizing. "He's moving toward the back of the house." The heavy window frame groaned, then shrieked in protest as Bodert hauled it open, tearing the warped tracks completely out of the cinderblock wall. He vaulted through the opening, landing heavily on the plywood subfloor, the Benelli sweeping the dark. He found Cruz kneeling in the corner, her gray t-shirt soaked black with fresh blood. Bodert moved to her, grabbing her by the belt to haul her to her feet. She swayed heavily against him. "I'm fine," she lied, her teeth gritted against the pane. He went toward the rear utility rooms. "He's dragging his left leg." Bodert looked down the dark, skeletal corridor. A trail of wet, heavy drops was faintly visible on the light-colored plywood subfloor, leading away from the shattered pine studs. Arthur Vance was bleeding out. But a cornered predator, in a dark, familiar cage, was infinitely more dangerous than a healthy one out in the open. "Stay behind me," Bodert ordered. He raised the shotgun and stepped out into the hallway, following the blood trail deeper into the black house. Chapter 15. The blood trail wasn't hard to follow. Arthur Vance's shattered thigh was pumping a steady, rhythmic volume of deep crimson onto the pale plywood subfloor. In the absolute darkness of the east wing, the wet spots looked like drops of spilled oil. Bodert moved with the Benelli M4 tucked tight to his shoulder. He kept his footfalls light, rolling his weight from heel to toe to keep the plywood from groaning. Behind him, Elena Cruz matched his pace. Her breathing was a ragged, wet rasp in the quiet house. The adrenaline was failing her, fighting a losing war against the blood steadily soaking the left side of her gray t-shirt. She kept her Glock 19 raised, covering their 6 o'clock, watching the dark corridor behind them. The blood trail led out of the unfinished hallway and spilled into the cavernous space of the mansion's rear kitchen. The room was massive, designed to hold a 30-foot island and commercial-grade appliances. Right now, it was a graveyard of construction supplies. Stacks of heavy concrete backerboard, crates of imported tile, and spools of thick electrical wire sat in the dark like waiting headstones. Bodert stopped at the threshold. He swept the muzzle of the Benelli across the room, tracking the shadows. The blood trail cut a straight, unbroken line across the kitchen, heading directly toward a narrow, framed-out corridor on the far wall. The blueprint likely called for a walk-in butler's pantry, connecting the kitchen to the formal dining room. Bodert stared at the dark opening of the pantry. It was a perfect, textbook fatal funnel. 3 feet wide, enclosed by exposed pine studs on both sides. He went into the pantry, Cruz whispered, her voice barely carrying over the distant hum of the slough outside. He's cornered. He's not cornered, Bodert breathed. He lowered the shotgun an inch, his eyes tracking the geometry of the raw, unfinished walls. He's an architect of empty spaces. He wouldn't trap himself in a dead end. Bodert shifted his gaze away from the blood trail, looking at the skeletal framing separating the kitchen from the adjacent dining room. There was no drywall, just bare vertical 2x4s, spaced 16 inches apart. A man standing in the dark dining room would have a perfectly clear, unobstructed view of anyone walking into the kitchen. "Back up," Bodert said sharply. He realized the trap a fraction of a second too late. Vance hadn't gone into the pantry. He had intentionally bled a heavy, unbroken trail to draw their eyes straight ahead, and then he had stepped sideways through the bare studs into the dining room. Pia theft. Pia theft. The muzzle flashes sparked from the deep shadows of the dining room, firing laterally through the exposed framing. The first 9mm round tore through Bodert's canvas jacket, grazing his left bicep. The second round didn't graze anything. It slammed squarely into Bodert's left side, just below the ribcage, right where the heavy canvas offered absolutely no resistance. The kinetic impact was devastating. It felt like being hit in the ribs with a sledgehammer swung by a professional. Bodert's breath exploded from his lungs in a violent rush. The world tilted sickeningly. His legs turned to water, buckling instantly under his weight. He crashed hard onto the plywood subfloor, the Benelli M4 clattering out of his grip and sliding 3 feet away into the dark. "John!" Cruz screamed. She didn't freeze. She didn't drop to check his pulse. Her tactical training overrode the panic. She pivoted toward the dining room framing, raised the Glock 19, and unleashed a massive deafening wave of suppressing fire. The heavy extended magazine fed rounds flawlessly. Cruz emptied 10 shots through the pine studs in 3 seconds, sweeping the muzzle left to right, tearing the skeletal walls to shreds. The rapid gunfire forced Vance to drop, cutting off his angle. Cruz grabbed Bodert by the heavy collar of his canvas jacket. Ignoring the searing, white-hot agony tearing through her own left arm, she planted her boots and hauled him violently backward. She dragged him behind a pallet of concrete backerboard, stacked waist-high near the kitchen island plumbing. She dropped him behind the heavy cement boards and slammed her back against the cover, her chest heaving. She hit the magazine release on her Glock, dumped the half-empty clip onto the plywood, and drove a fresh 30-round extended magazine into the well. "John," Cruz gasped, dropping to her knees beside him. Bodert was lying on his back. He wasn't dead, but his breathing was shallow and erratic. He reached down with his right hand, pressing it against his left side. His fingers came away slick and hot. The 9mm hollow point had missed his spine, but it had chewed a massive bleeding hole through his obliques. Every time he drew a breath, The torn muscle fibers ground together, sending a blinding spike of agony straight to the base of his skull. "I'm hit," Bodert grunted. His voice was a weak, wet rasp. "I know. Keep pressure on it." Cruz grabbed his hand and shoved it hard against the bleeding wound. "Don't let go." She peeked over the top edge of the concrete backer board. The kitchen was plunged back into heavy silence. The smell of copper and cordite was suffocating in the stagnant air. 30 feet away, the heavy, dragging scrape of Arthur Vance's boot echoed against the plywood. He was moving again. Not running. Stalking. "He's shifting his angle," Cruz whispered, ducking back down. She checked the chamber of her Glock. "He's bleeding out from the thigh wound, but he's got the high ground. He knows the floor plan. He's going to flank this pallet." Bodert gritted his teeth, forcing himself to roll onto his right side. The movement sent a fresh wave of nausea washing over him. He looked past Cruz's boots, spotting the Benelli M4 lying on the floorboards, completely exposed in the center of the kitchen. "The shotgun," Bodert choked out. "Leave it," Cruz ordered. "If you step out from behind this cover, he will put a bullet through your head. We can't hold a fixed position. Not in the dark." Bodert forced himself up onto one knee, leaning his entire weight against the stack of cement boards. Sweat poured down his face, cutting through the thick layer of drywall dust coating his skin. "If he flanks us, you only have the Glock. You can't lay down enough spread to stop him." Another heavy, dragging step echoed from the dining room. It was closer this time, moving toward the open archway that connected the two rooms. Vance was boxing them in. Cruz looked at Bodert. She saw the pale ashen gray of his face and the dark blood pooling steadily on the plywood beneath him. He was bleeding out fast. They had maybe 3 minutes before shock set in and dropped his blood pressure to 0. She looked at the Benelli, lying 10 feet away in the open. "Cover me," Cruz said. Before Bodert could grab her, Cruz broke from cover. She didn't sprint. She stayed low, sliding across the plywood on her knees, driving herself out into the fatal funnel of the open kitchen. PFF'd. PFF'd. The suppressed 9mm spit from the darkness. A round shattered the floorboards an inch from Cruz's right boot. She didn't flinch. She grabbed the barrel of the Benelli, hauled it backward, and scrambled desperately toward the pallet of backer board. She dove behind the cover just as a third suppressed round chewed a chunk of cement board off the top edge of the stack, showering them both in fine gray dust. Cruz hit the floor hard, sliding the shotgun across the plywood into Bodert's waiting hand. "I told you to leave it," Bodert rasped, his fingers locking around the familiar, textured grip of the M4. "You told me I couldn't lay down enough spread," Cruz countered, her back pressed against the cement boards. She raised the Glock, aiming at the dark archway. "So lay it down." Bodert racked the pump. The sharp, mechanical clack was a heavy, intimidating promise in the dark. He ignored the burning fire in his side, resting the barrel of the shotgun against the edge of the backer board. Arthur Vance had set a brilliant, ruthless trap. But he had made one fundamental error. He had trapped two people who were entirely willing to tear the house down around them. Chapter 16. Bodert didn't aim for a silhouette in the dark. He aimed for the architecture. He listened for the heavy scrape of Arthur Vance's boot against the plywood subfloor. The sound came from the left side of the framed-out archway, exactly where the exposed pine studs offered a clear line of sight into the kitchen. Bodert pressed the stock of the Benelli M4 tight into his shoulder, braced his weight against the stack of cement board, and pulled the trigger. The 12-gauge roared. In the pitch-black, cavernous kitchen, the muzzle flash was a blinding 3-foot tongue of orange fire. The concussive shockwave hit Cruz in the chest. The heavy spread of buckshot didn't just hit the pine studs, it eradicated them. 2 vertical 2x4s simply ceased to exist, splintering into thousands of jagged, high-velocity wooden shrapnel needles that ripped through the dark dining room. The recoil of the shotgun drove the steel stock backward into Bodert's shoulder. The kinetic energy transferred directly down his torso, ripping through his torn obliques. A blinding, white-hot spike of pure agony shot up his spine. He tasted copper. He racked the pump, spitting the smoking red shell onto the plywood, and fired again. Boom! He swept the muzzle 2 feet to the right, systematically logging the skeletal wall. A ragged, high-pitched scream echoed from the dining room. It wasn't the scream of a confident predator. It was the sound of a man who had just had his cover turned into a claymore mine. Vance fired back blindly. PFF'd. 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 The suppressed 9mm rounds went wide, chewing into the ceiling joists and shattering a stack of imported ceramic tiles 20 feet away. He was firing in a panic, completely disoriented by the concussive blasts and the blinding strobe of the shotgun. Moving! Cruz yelled, her ears ringing so hard she could barely hear her own voice. She broke from the cover of the cement boards. She didn't stay low this time. She charged straight across the open kitchen floor, using the deafening roar of Bodert's covering fire to mask her approach. Bodert fired a third time, obliterating the right side of the archway, then lowered the weapon, fighting the black edges creeping into his peripheral vision. His side was on fire. Cruz hit the shattered threshold of the dining room. The air was unbreathable, choked with pulverized wood and drywall dust. She swept her Glock 19 through the haze. Vance was on the floor 10 feet away. He had dropped his night vision harness. His face was a bloody, shredded mess from the flying wood splinters. He was clutching his left arm, his gray polo shirt rapidly turning black where a stray piece of buckshot had caught his shoulder. He saw Cruz breach the archway and desperately swung the suppressed 9mm toward her. Cruz didn't shoot him. She kicked him. Moving with the brutal, practiced speed of a street-level brawl, she drove her heavy right boot squarely into Vance's wrist. Bone cracked. The suppressed pistol flew out of his grip, skittering across the plywood and disappearing into the dark. Vance screamed, rolling away from her, clutching his broken wrist against his chest. Cruz leveled the Glock at his head. Her left arm hung uselessly at her side, soaked in her own blood, but her right hand was an absolute vice around the grip of the pistol. "Don't move," Cruz rasped, her chest heaving. "Don't even breathe." Vance looked up at her. The arrogant, composed, Mr. Lonely persona was completely gone, burned away by the shotgun blasts and the blood loss. He looked at the muzzle of the Glock. He looked at the furious, unhinged grief in Cruz's eyes. He performed the exact same terrifying math he forced his victims to calculate. He realized the woman standing over him had absolutely zero intention of reading him his rights. Vance didn't beg. He played his last card. With a sudden, explosive burst of animal panic, Vance threw himself backward. He scrambled on his good hand and his good knee, launching his body toward the rear wall of the dining room. "Stop!" Cruz shouted, tracking him with the Glock. The rear wall of the mansion wasn't finished. Instead of French doors, the opening was temporarily sealed with a massive, floor-to-ceiling sheet of half-inch oriented strand board to keep the weather out. Vance didn't slow down. He hit the heavy plywood barrier shoulder first with the momentum of a desperate, cornered rat. The temporary framing nails shrieked and gave way. The entire sheet of OSB blew outward, crashing down onto the concrete patio outside. Arthur Vance tumbled out with it, rolling through the debris and spilling directly into the driving rain and the absolute darkness of the Florida night. Cruz sprinted to the jagged opening, raising her weapon, but she was too late. The heavy canopy of the Loxahatchee slough had already swallowed him. She could hear him crashing through the sawgrass, the sound rapidly fading beneath the deafening drone of the cicadas and the croaking frogs. She lowered the Glock and turned back toward the kitchen. Bodert was still slumped behind the pallet of cement board. He had dropped the Benelli. His head was resting against the cold concrete backer, his eyes half closed. The blood pooling beneath him on the plywood was spreading fast, a dark, terrible stain in the ambient light. Cruz ran back to him, dropping to her knees, sliding on the slick floorboards. "He's gone," Cruz panted, pressing her right hand hard against Bodert's torn side. "He went out the back. He's in the swamp." Bodert's chest rose and fell in shallow, jagged hitches. His skin was gray, covered in a fine layer of white dust and sweat. He opened his eyes, looking at her hand pressing against his ribs. "He's bleeding," Bodert whispered, his voice incredibly weak. "He took a piece of buckshot to the shoulder, and I broke his wrist," Cruz said. "He's unarmed. But you're bleeding out, John. If we don't pack this wound and get a tourniquet on it right now, you're going to code on this floor. If we stop, he bleeds his trail out in the water." Bodert gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw jumping. "He knows the slough. We lose him." "I don't care about the slough," Cruz yelled, the desperation finally breaking her composure. "You are not dying in an empty house for my sister." Bodert reached up with his blood-slick right hand and gripped her wrist. His grip was weak, trembling with the effort, but his eyes were flat and absolute. "You didn't ask me to save your life, Elena," Bodert rasped, staring through her. "You asked me to find the ghost. He's bleeding in the mud. Finish it." He let go of her wrist, reached out, and grabbed the textured grip of the Benelli M4 lying on the floor. He didn't try to stand up using his core. He jammed the rubber buttstock of the shotgun against the plywood subfloor and used the heavy steel barrel like a crutch. He forced himself up onto his right knee. A low guttural groan tore out of his throat as the torn muscles in his side stretched and screamed. Cruz tried to push him back down, but he shoved her hand away. He planted his boot, put his entire weight on the shotgun, and hauled himself to his feet. He swayed violently for 2 seconds, leaning heavily against the stack of cement boards until the room stopped spinning. "John, you can't walk," Cruz pleaded. "Watch me." Bodert pulled the shotgun up, tucking the stock tight under his right arm, pressing his left hand hard against his bleeding side to hold himself together. He limped forward, dragging his left leg slightly, moving toward the gaping hole in the back wall. The humid, swamp-scented wind blew into the dark dining room. Cruz looked at the pool of blood he left behind. She looked at the man literally holding his own body together through sheer, violent willpower. She checked the magazine in her Glock, slammed it back into the well, and moved to cover his flank. They stepped out through the shattered framing, leaving the sterile, unpainted walls of the mansion behind, and descended into the deep, black water of the Loxahatchee Slough. Chapter 17. Stepping through the shattered plywood barrier was like walking off the edge of the earth. The Loxahatchee Slough immediately swallowed the ambient light from the mansion, plunging Bodert and Cruz into a suffocating, absolute blackness. The rain was falling in a steady, heavy sheet, driven by the lingering winds of the coastal storm. Bodert's right boot slid off the edge of the concrete patio and sank 12 inches into thick, foul-smelling peat. He groaned, his jaw locking tight as the sudden shift in elevation tore at the bullet hole in his side. He leaned heavily on the barrel of the Benelli M4, driving the steel muzzle deep into the mud to keep himself upright. The water in the slough wasn't just standing puddles. It was a slow-moving, waist-deep sheet flowing south toward the Everglades. Cruz dropped down beside him, the water instantly soaking her jeans to the thigh. "Keep the light off," Bodert rasped, his breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. "If you turn it on, he'll see us before we see him." "How do we track him in the dark?" Cruz whispered, sweeping the barrel of the Glock 19 across the invisible tree line. "The rain is washing his blood away the second it hits the water. He has a shattered thigh and a broken wrist. He isn't swimming. He's dragging himself." Bodert forced his left leg forward, pulling his boot out of the muck with a loud, sucking pop. We tracked the brakes. They pushed into the tall sawgrass. The serrated edges of the reeds whipped against their faces and arms in the wind, slicing fine, stinging cuts into their wet skin. The slough smelled of decaying vegetation, sulfur, and ancient mud. It was a primordial soup that actively resisted human intrusion. With every step, Bodert felt the warm, terrifying slide of his own blood leaking down his left flank, mingling with the swamp water soaking his jeans. The tunnel vision was creeping in, a dark, fuzzy ring closing around the edges of his sight. He was bleeding out. He had maybe 20 minutes of vertical movement left before his heart simply didn't have enough fluid to pump. "Here," Cruz breathed, stopping a few feet to his right. Bodert waded over, leaning heavily on the shotgun. Cruz wasn't using her flashlight, but her eyes had adjusted to the ambient starlight filtering through the heavy cloud cover. She pointed down at the wall of sawgrass. A path, 3 feet wide, had been violently crushed flat against the black water. Arthur Vance had crawled through it, dragging his useless left leg. "He's heading for the cypress dome," Bodert said, looking ahead at a dense, towering cluster of massive trees rising out of the water like the ribs of a leviathan. "The water gets deeper there. He thinks he can hide in the root systems." They followed the crushed reeds, moving at a grueling, agonizing pace. The water rose to their waists. Submerged roots and submerged limestone shelves caught their boots, turning every step into a calculated risk. 10 yards into the deep water, Bodert's left knee buckled. He didn't make a sound, but his momentum carried him forward, plunging him face first into the dark, foul water. Cruz reacted instantly. She holstered her weapon, grabbed the heavy canvas of his jacket with her one good hand, and hauled him upward. She threw her shoulder under his right arm, bracing his weight against her own body, ignoring the white-hot flare of agony from her torn bicep. Bodert breached the surface, coughing violently, spitting brackish water and mud from his lungs. "I've got you," Cruz grunted, locking her arm around his waist, struggling to keep them both upright in the waist-deep muck. "I've got you, John. Keep moving." Bodert leaned against her. He felt the trembling in her frame. She was running on nothing but pure, unadulterated vengeance and adrenaline. "The gun," Bodert gasped. He had dropped the Benelli when he fell. He felt around in the dark water with his right boot, his toe catching the heavy steel barrel. He reached down into the muck and pulled the shotgun back up. It was dripping with mud, algae, and swampweed, but the pump action was built to fire full of sand. It would cycle. "I can walk," Bodert said. "Shut up," Cruz snapped, refusing to let go of his waist. "You're gray. If you fall again, I won't be able to pull you out of the mud. We do this together." They waded forward, a 3-legged bleeding machine, pushing deeper into the dark. The canopy of the cypress dome closed over them, blocking out the rain and plunging the world into a claustrophobic, oppressive stillness. The trunks of the ancient trees were massive, fluted at the base, surrounded by hundreds of woody knees sticking up from the black water like jagged stalagmites. The crushed trail of sawgrass ended abruptly where the deep water began. Cruz stopped. She unholstered the Glock, resting the barrel over Bodert's right shoulder, her eyes frantically sweeping the dark, twisted shapes of the cypress roots. "He's here," Cruz whispered, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. "He didn't make it to the other side. He's in the dome." Bodert stopped breathing. He closed his eyes, filtering out the sound of the rain hitting the canopy above, tuning his hearing entirely to the waterline. The frogs weren't croaking. The insects were dead silent. The dome was holding its breath. Splash drag. The sound came from there 2 o'clock. Faint, heavy, and desperate. The sound of a man trying to pull his own dead weight over a submerged log. Bodert tapped Cruz's arm. He didn't speak. He just pointed the muddy barrel of the Benelli into the dark. They moved toward the sound, navigating the jagged cypress knees with agonizing care. The water grew colder, rising to the bottom of Bodert's ribcage. His torn obliques burned as the foul swamp water flooded the gunshot wound. 30 feet ahead, a massive ancient cypress tree had fallen decades ago, its trunk creating a natural dam across the deep water. Huddled against the rotting bark, waist-deep in the black slough, was Arthur Vance. He was trapped. The water on the other side of the log was too deep, and he couldn't pull himself over the slick, moss-covered wood with a shattered thigh and a broken wrist. He was backed into the roots, shivering violently, his shredded face pale in the gloom. He heard the ripple of water as Bodert and Cruz approached. Vance slowly turned his head. He didn't have his suppressed 9mm. He didn't have his night vision. He didn't have his sanitized, bleach-smelling apartment or his carefully arranged pink carnations. He was stripped completely bare, exposed as nothing more than a pathetic, terrified animal drowning in the mud. Cruz stopped 10 feet away. She let go of Bodert's waist, letting him balance his weight entirely on the shotgun. She stepped forward, raising the Glock 19 with a two-handed grip, the water swirling around her hips. She didn't say a word. She didn't read him his rights. She just raised the front sight, centering it directly between Arthur Vance's terrified eyes. Vance pressed his back against the rotting log. He raised his good hand, the water streaming down his face, his chest heaving with panicked, ragged breaths. "Wait," Vance choked out, his voice a pathetic high-pitched whine. "Wait. Please." Cruz didn't lower the gun. Her finger curled around the trigger, taking in the slack. The ghost was finally cornered. Chapter 18. The heavy, driving rain finally broke, tapering off into a thin, suffocating drizzle that barely disturbed the black water of the slough. The only sounds in the cypress dome were the steady drip, drip, drip of water falling from the canopy and the panicked, ragged wheezing of Arthur Vance's breathing. He pressed himself harder against the rotting cypress log, trying to merge his body with the wood. The water swirled around his waist, dark and freezing. "You don't understand," Vance babbled, his voice cracking. He held his good right hand up, the palm facing Cruz. His left arm hung useless in the water, the wrist shattered. "You're cops. I know you're cops. You have to arrest me. You have to take me in." Cruz didn't answer. She stood waist-deep in the muck, the Glock 19 locked in a perfect two-handed grip. The muzzle was perfectly aligned with the center of Vance's forehead. 10 feet away, Bodert leaned his entire weight against the trunk of a massive cypress tree. His legs were failing. The cold swamp water was actively seeping into the gunshot wound in his side, numbing the initial burning agony into a deep, terrifying, hollow ache. He knew what that numbness meant. His body was shutting down the extremities, hoarding the last few pints of warm blood for his vital organs. "I have money," Vance tried, his eyes darting frantically between Cruz and the dark barrel of her weapon. "Not here, but I have accounts. The offshore escrow I use for the broker. I can give you the routing numbers. Just put the gun down." Cruz took a single, slow step forward. The water rippled gently against her jeans. She didn't blink. The rain plastered her dark hair to her face, highlighting the jagged, bleeding cut on her cheek from the wood splinters in the mansion. "I'm not here for your money," Cruz said. Her voice was terrifyingly devoid of anger. It wasn't a shout. It was a flat, mechanical statement of fact. Vance swallowed hard. He looked at her eyes, searching for a recognizable emotion, fear, greed, even rage. He found absolutely nothing. Just the cold, bottomless gravity of an executioner. "Then what do you want?" Vance pleaded, tears of pain and terror finally spilling down his shredded face. "I didn't mean to hurt them. I never meant for it to go that far. It was an accident. The doses they were too strong. I just wanted them to sleep, so they wouldn't leave." You bought the carnations before you met them, Bodert rasped from the shadows, his voice weak but carrying the heavy weight of the truth. You bought the bleach. You didn't make mistakes, Arthur. You set a stage. Vance's head snapped toward Bodert. I just wanted someone to look at me. Do you know what it's like? Walking through empty mansions all day. Being completely invisible? I just wanted a weekend. I just wanted to pretend I had a life. You pretended, Cruz said quietly. She took another step forward. She was 5 feet away now. And then you strangled Sophia. The name hit Vance like a physical blow. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The frantic, desperate gears turning in his head suddenly locked. He stared at Cruz's face, tracing the sharp line of her jaw, the dark eyes, the cheekbones. The family resemblance, hidden before by the darkness and the chaos of the shootout, was suddenly undeniable in the pale ambient light. Sophia, Vance whispered. She was 24, Cruz said, her finger tightening slightly on the trigger. The slack vanished from the mechanism. She had a life. And you put her on a cheap motel mattress and left pink grocery store flowers on her nightstand to make yourself feel better. Vance scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go. His back was flush against the massive, immovable log. The deep water on the other side offered no escape. He was a rat, trapped at the bottom of a bucket. She liked me. Vance cried out, a pathetic delusional defense mechanism flaring to life. She did. We went to the steakhouse. We talked for hours. She told me I was a good listener. She wasn't like the others, she actually saw me. She saw a paycheck, Cruz cut him off. The absolute cruelty of the truth meant to completely dismantle his fantasy. She saw a pathetic, unremarkable man who was willing to pay triple her hourly rate just to have someone pretend he mattered. She didn't see you, Arthur. Nobody sees you. You are a ghost. And you're going to die in the mud. Cruz closed the final gap. She stepped right up to the log. She thrust the Glock forward, pressing the hot steel of the muzzle directly against the skin of Arthur Vance's forehead. Vance shrieked, a high-pitched guttural sound of pure animal terror. He squeezed his eyes shut and turned his head away, waiting for the flash. Bodert watched her from the shadows of the cypress tree. He saw the muscles in Cruz's forearms lock tight. He saw the rigid, immovable set of her shoulders. She had survived the ambush in Lake Worth, the destruction of the Airstream, the gunfire in the dark mansion, and the grueling trek through the slough for exactly this microscopic fraction of a second. She was going to pull the trigger. She was going to blow Arthur Vance's skull apart, leaving his body to sink into the peat and the algae, and she was going to call it justice. But Bodert knew the math. He knew the exact toll that bullet would take. It wouldn't hit Vance. It would pass straight through the killer and completely obliterate the woman standing on the other side of the gun. Marta's voice echoed in his fading consciousness. She's you, 5 years ago. Walking around with a badge that didn't matter, looking for an excuse to break the people who broke the rules. Bodert let go of the cypress trunk. He didn't use the shotgun for balance. He forced his failing legs to move, stepping away from the tree, out into the open water. A wave of dizziness washed over him, turning the swamp into a blurry, spinning kaleidoscope of dark greens and grays. He bit down on the inside of his cheek, using the pain to anchor his mind. Elena, Bodert said. His voice was a gravelly, exhausted rasp. Cruz didn't turn around. Her eyes remained locked on Vance's trembling, averted face. The barrel of the Glock remained perfectly still, pressed against the killer's skin. Back off, John, Cruz whispered. This isn't your case anymore. He's done, Elena. He has a shattered femur. He's bleeding out. He isn't going anywhere. He's going to hell, she said, her voice shaking with the sheer gravitational pull of the vengeance standing right in front of her. He killed 4 women. He killed my sister. If we drag him out of here, he gets a trial. He gets a defense attorney who claims the forensics were contaminated by a suspended cop. He gets 3 hot meals a day while Sophia rots in the ground. If you pull that trigger, Bodert said, taking another slow, agonizing step forward, he wins. He's dead if I pull the trigger. He doesn't win. He wins because he proves his point. Bodert stopped 2 feet behind her. He let the Benelli M4 slip from his grip. The heavy shotgun hit the black water with a dull splash, sinking instantly into the mud. He didn't need it anymore. He thinks the world is just violent animals operating without rules. He thinks everyone is exactly like him, just hiding it better. You execute him in the mud, you prove him right. You become the monster. Cruz's breathing hitched. A single tear broke loose, mingling with the rainwater on her cheek, but her grip on the pistol didn't waver. I don't care, she choked out. I don't care what I become. I do, Bodert said quietly. He reached out with his right hand, ignoring the searing pain in his side, and gently placed his palm over the top of the Glock slide, resting his fingers over hers. Chapter 19. The steel slide of the Glock was freezing under Bodert's palm. Elena Cruz didn't look at him. She stared straight down the barrel at Arthur Vance, her jaw locked so tight the muscles trembled. The rain dripped from the cypress canopy, striking the black water of the slough with a hollow, rhythmic ticking. Take your hand off my gun, John, Cruz whispered. No. Bodert's voice was barely a rasp. The adrenaline that had carried him out of the mansion and into the swamp was evaporating, leaving behind a cold, terrifying void. He pressed his fingers down, locking the slide of the Glock in place. If she pulled the trigger now, the gun would fire 1 round, but the casing wouldn't eject. It would jam. He was forcing a mechanical failure to buy a psychological second. He killed her, Cruz said, her voice cracking, the absolute certainty of her vengeance beginning to war with the sudden heavy weight of Bodert's hand. He treated her like a prop, like a doll. He deserves to die in the mud. He deserves worse, Bodert agreed. His knees buckled slightly. He caught himself, leaning his weight heavily against her shoulder. But I don't give a damn about what Arthur Vance deserves. I care about what happens to you tomorrow. Vance let out a pathetic, shuddering whimper, pressing his head back against the rotting log. Please. Shut your mouth, Bodert snapped, the raw aggression silencing the killer instantly. He turned his focus entirely back to the woman holding the gun. Listen to me, Elena, Bodert said, fighting the dark edges closing in on his peripheral vision. I made this choice 5 years ago in a grocery store parking lot. I caught a man who hurt people, and I decided the badge wasn't heavy enough. I decided to be the wrecking ball. I didn't shoot him, but I beat him until the concrete turned red. Cruz's finger remained tight against the trigger guard, but she finally dragged her eyes away from Vance to look at Bodert. She saw the pale ashen gray of his skin, and the dark blood diluting into the swamp water around his waist. I thought I was balancing the ledger, Bodert continued, his breathing shallow and jagged. But the ledger doesn't balance. You let the wrecking ball swing, and it doesn't just crush the monster. It takes down the whole house. It cost me my career. It cost me my wife. It cost me every piece of a normal life I ever had. Look at me. I live in a rusted metal tube that this piece of shit just burned to the ground. That is what vengeance buys you. He squeezed her hand. If you pull that trigger, Arthur Vance's problems are over. But yours are just beginning. You will carry his dead weight for the rest of your life. You'll wake up every morning and see his face in the mirror right next to Sophia's. Cruz stared at him. The cold, mechanical executioner that had marched into the slough was fracturing. The grief was rushing back in, flooding the empty spaces where the anger had been. "I can't let him walk away," she choked out, a fresh tear cutting a clean line through the dirt and gunpowder residue on her cheek. "He's not walking anywhere," Bodert said. "He has a shattered femur. He's going to spend the rest of his life in a concrete box 6 feet wide. He's going to eat terrible food. He's going to sleep on a steel rack. And he's going to live for decades knowing a woman with a badge put him there. That's not a victory for him, Elena. That's a slow, agonizing burial." He took his hand off the top of the Glock. He didn't try to disarm her. He stepped back, giving her the space to make the final calculation. "Be the detective," Bodert whispered, echoing Marta's ultimate lesson. "Don't be the wrecking ball." Cruz looked back at Arthur Vance. The ghost of Palm Beach County was weeping openly, his chest heaving, his ruined hands floating uselessly in the black water. He was a pathetic, broken shell of a man. He wasn't a mastermind. He wasn't a mastermind. He was just a coward who couldn't handle the real world. Killing him wouldn't bring Sophia back. It would only drag Elena Cruz down into the exact same dark, empty hole Vance had dug for himself. Cruz let out a long, ragged exhale that sounded like a physical weight hitting the floor. She slowly lowered the Glock. She decocked the weapon and shoved it back into the Kydex holster at her waist. The tension broke. The terrifying, lethal atmosphere that had suffocated the Cypress Dome instantly evaporated, leaving nothing but the sound of the rain and the croaking frogs. Vance let out a loud, pathetic sob of relief. "Don't speak," Cruz snapped at him, her voice finding its solid, authoritative edge again. "If you open your mouth, I will break your other wrist." She turned back to Bodert. The moment the threat was neutralized, Bodert's adrenaline completely crashed. The sheer willpower holding him upright vanished. His eyes rolled back and his legs gave way. He collapsed backward into the dark water. Cruz lunged, catching him by the collar of his heavy canvas jacket before he went under. She hauled him up, dragging his dead weight against her side. "John," she yelled, slapping his pale cheek. "John, stay with me." Bodert groaned, his eyelids fluttering. "Zip ties," he mumbled, his voice slurred. "Left pocket." Cruz reached into his soaked jacket and pulled out 2 heavy-duty plastic zip ties. She turned to Vance, grabbing him by the collar of his ruined polo shirt, and hauled him away from the log. Vance shrieked as his shattered thigh moved, but Cruz ignored him. She bound his wrists together with brutal efficiency, leaving him completely immobilized in the shallow water. She turned her attention back to Bodert. He was fading fast. The bleeding from his side hadn't stopped. "We have to move," Cruz said, throwing Bodert's right arm over her shoulder. She gritted her teeth against the searing pain in her own torn bicep, taking the brunt of his weight. "We're walking out of here, John. Right now." "Vance," Bodert muttered. "He can drown for all I care," Cruz said fiercely. "But I'm not leaving you in this swamp." She hauled Bodert forward, beginning the agonizing, waist-deep trek back through the black water. It was a brutal, mechanical slog. Every step was a battle against the thick mud and the submerged cypress roots. Bodert tried to move his legs, but his boots just dragged heavily through the peat. It took them 30 minutes to clear the deep water and reach the crushed sawgrass trail leading back to the mansion. By the time they reached the edge of the clearing, the sky above the slough was turning a deep, bruised purple. The storm was finally breaking. The half-finished mansion sat silent and dark. Cruz dragged Bodert across the muddy yard, bypassing the shattered back patio where the gunfight had started. She aimed straight for the banyan trees where Vance had hidden his White County inspection truck. She reached the truck, propped Bodert against the front quarter panel, and opened the driver's door. The keys were sitting in the center console. She didn't hesitate. She threw Bodert's arm over her shoulder one last time, hauling him up into the passenger seat, and shoved his legs inside. He slumped against the window, his breathing terribly shallow. Cruz slammed his door, sprinted around the front of the truck, and climbed behind the wheel. She fired up the engine. The V8 roared to life, a beautiful mechanical sound of salvation. She didn't look back at the dark mansion, and she didn't look back at the swamp where Arthur Vance was currently lying tied up in the freezing water. She slammed the truck into drive, hit the gas, and tore down the dirt driveway. She was a suspended detective, driving a stolen county vehicle with a bleeding, unlicensed investigator in the passenger seat. They had broken a dozen laws and left a trail of destruction 10 miles wide. But as the tires hit the paved county highway, and Cruz pointed the heavy grill toward the nearest coastal hospital, she didn't feel like a monster. For the first time since she had looked at her sister's body on a stainless steel table, the ledger in her head finally felt clean. Chapter 20. The Palm Beach County Hospital discharged him 22 days after he arrived, bleeding out in the passenger seat of a stolen municipal truck. The surgeon had extracted the 9mm hollow point from his left oblique, repaired the torn muscle fascia, and stapled him back together with 34 stainless steel clips. He had lost 3 pints of blood in the swamp. He was 20 pounds lighter, his face hollowed out beneath a thick, unkempt beard, and he walked with a pronounced heavy drag on his left side. Bodert leaned his weight on a cheap, black aluminum pharmacy cane as he stepped out of the air-conditioned taxi and onto the crushed limestone of his dirt track. The cab driver didn't wait around. He took his cash, threw the sedan into reverse, and tore out of the scrub oak, leaving Bodert alone in the suffocating mid-morning heat. The lot was silent. The cicadas were buzzing their electric hum in the palmettos. The rusted Ford F-250 sat parked exactly where he had left it weeks ago, before the fire. Detective Rivas had arranged for a county tow truck to pull it out of the bushes near Thorne's old estate and haul it back to the dirt track. It was her way of settling the ledger. Bodert didn't walk to the truck. He walked slowly toward the center of the lot. The concrete slab was scorched black. The Airstream was completely gone. The intense heat of the marine sealant fire had melted the aluminum skin down to the steel frame, leaving nothing but a twisted, charred skeleton of charred metal and ash resting on the concrete. The smell of burned petroleum and melted plastic still hung heavy in the stagnant air, baked into the sand by the August sun. Sitting on the tailgate of the rusted Ford waiting for him was Elena Cruz. She wore faded jeans and a plain white t-shirt. The heavy white medical tape was gone from her left arm, replaced by a neat healing scar visible just below the sleeve. The dark, bruising exhaustion that had hung under her eyes since the day they met was completely gone. She looked lighter. She looked like someone who had finally set a heavy bag down in the dirt and walked away from it. She stood up as Bodert hobbled toward the slab, the rubber tip of his cane crunching loudly on the limestone. "They officially indicted him yesterday," Cruz said, skipping the small talk entirely. "First-degree murder. 4 counts." Bodert stopped at the edge of the scorched concrete. "Did he sing?" "Like a choir boy," Cruz nodded, a grim, satisfied smile touching the corner of her mouth. The second the state attorney mentioned the needle, Arthur Vance folded. He gave them the locations of the encrypted servers, the routing numbers for the offshore accounts, and the exact locations of the evidence he tried to burn. "The public defender is trying to negotiate life without parole." "And Hayes and Miller?" Bodert asked, leaning heavily on the cane. "Rivas tore them apart in front of the captain," Cruz said. She laid out the entire timeline, showed the brass exactly how a suspended detective and an unlicensed spy solved a serial case while 2 active homicide detectives were busy harassing witnesses at a steakhouse. They both got transferred to property and evidence. They'll be logging stolen bicycles until they retire. Bodert looked out over the charred remains of his home. "What about you, Elena?" Cruz reached into her back pocket. She didn't pull out a gun. She pulled out a small, freshly printed piece of thick cardstock and held it out. Bodert took it. It was a temporary State of Florida Private Investigator Class C license. "I didn't wait for Internal Affairs to officially fire me," Cruz said, her voice steady and clear. "I walked into the precinct last week, dropped my badge on the captain's desk, and resigned. I don't want to wear the uniform anymore, John. I don't want to follow their rules. It's a lonely way to make a living." "I know." She looked at the burned wreckage on the slab. "And it doesn't pay very well." Bodert handed the card back. "You pulled the trigger in the swamp. You never would have passed the background check for that license. They would have booked you for murder too." Cruz looked down at the piece of cardstock. She traced her own printed name with her thumb. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the memory of the black water, the rain, and the cold steel of the Glock pressed against Arthur Vance's forehead. "I know," she whispered. She finally looked up, meeting his eyes. The absolute, unvarnished gratitude in her gaze was heavier than the grief had been. "You saved my life in that house, John. But you saved my soul in the mud. I won't forget it." She stepped forward, wrapped her arms carefully around his shoulders, avoiding the stapled wound on his side, and hugged him. It was brief, firm, and completely devoid of sentimentality. It was the embrace of a soldier, acknowledging another soldier who had carried them off the field. She stepped back, walked around the front of the Ford, and climbed into a used dark blue sedan parked in the shade of the oaks. The silver Honda Civic was gone, swallowed by an impound lot somewhere in Lake Worth. She started the engine, rolled down the window, and looked at Bodert one last time. "If you ever need backup," Cruz called out over the idling engine, "you have my number." Bodert nodded once. Cruz put the sedan in gear and drove away. The dust plumed behind her tires, settling slowly over the palmettos as the sound of the engine faded toward the coastal highway. Bodert was completely alone. He turned back to the concrete slab. He walked into the center of the blackened footprint, the cane clicking softly. He kicked a piece of melted, warped aluminum with the toe of his boot. It skittered across the concrete and vanished into the weeds. He had absolutely nothing left. No shelter, no gun, no weather radio to warn him about the storms spinning up in the Gulf. He was a man standing on a scorched, empty square of concrete in the middle of a swamp. Bodert took a deep breath. The air smelled of salt, pine needles, and cold ash. It wasn't a defeat. It was a blank slate. The ledger was clean, and the ghost was locked in a box. He reached into his jeans pocket and pulled out his cell phone. The screen was still cracked in the bottom corner. He thumbed the contacts open, scrolled past Serena and Rivas, and hit the dial icon. He held the phone to his ear, listening to it ring across the flat, hot expanse of Palm Beach County. The line clicked. A loud, squawking noise echoed in the background, followed by the sound of a heavy man shifting his weight in a teakwood chair. "Crawley," the gruff voice answered. "Wade," Bodert said, turning his face up toward the blinding, indifferent Florida sun. "It's John. I need a favor." "You already owe me a favor for the seaplane intel, Bohannon. You're running a deficit." "Put it on my tab," Bodert said, a faint, razor-thin smile finally pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Ask around your network. See if anyone has a cheap, used travel trailer for sale. Aluminum, preferred. I don't care about the miles. It just needs a roof that doesn't leak." The end.